Some killers ran for decades. Some victims were never even named. But then, DNA spoke, graves were opened, and the lies unraveled. This is the moment the silence broke. Case 1. Boy in the Box, Joseph Augustus Zarelli, Philadelphia, USA. In 1957, a young boy was found wrapped in a plaid blanket and placed inside a cardboard box just off a dirt road in Philadelphia. There was no name, no missing person report. No one came forward. For 65 years, this child was buried beneath a nickname, America's Unknown Child. But in 2022, science gave him back his identity. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. On February 25, 1957, a college student searching for rabbits came across a discarded JCPenney bassinet box in the Fox Chase neighborhood. Inside was the body of a small boy, estimated to be 4 years old. He was naked, his hair was recently cut, and his body showed signs of prolonged mistreatment. Authorities from the Philadelphia Police Department were immediately called to the scene. Led by Captain David Roberts, detectives and medical examiner Dr. Joseph Spellman documented the injuries and launched one of the most intensive investigations the city had ever seen. The child's fingerprints were taken and distributed through state and federal channels. Sketches of the boy were printed on flyers and milk cartons. The FBI joined the search, and more than 400,000 posters were distributed across the country. Hospitals were contacted. School rosters were checked. But there were no matches, and no family came forward. In the decades that followed, the boy's image haunted Philadelphia. He was buried under a headstone that read only, "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy." As time passed, the case became symbolic of cold case despair, a mystery that refused to warm. Investigators followed every rumor, that he was a runaway from a foster home nearby, that he had been abandoned by a traveling carnival, or that he was the child of a reclusive family hiding abuse. But nothing could be proved. In 1998, the boy's body was exhumed in hopes that mitochondrial DNA could provide a breakthrough. It wasn't enough. The case went quiet again. It wasn't until 2019 that hope returned. With permission from the city, the boy's remains were exhumed a second time, this time for advanced DNA sequencing. The effort was coordinated by the Philadelphia Police Department's Cold Case Unit, led by Sergeant Bob Kuhlmeyer and Dieter Joe McDermott, and in partnership with the forensic lab Othram Inc. in Texas. The DNA extracted was far more complete than what had been gathered 2 decades earlier. Using forensic genetic genealogy, a method that compares unknown DNA profiles to voluntarily submitted data in public databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, genealogists began mapping potential family trees. Every relative match, even distant cousins, was traced through marriage records, birth certificates, and census logs. The process required cross-referencing with archival documents from the 1950s and constructing biological connections across multiple generations. Eventually, the data pointed to one family in particular. With court orders in hand, investigators accessed sealed birth certificates and confirmed what the DNA had already suggested. The boy in the box was Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born January 13, 1953, in Philadelphia. His biological parents, Augustus J. Gus Zarelli and Mary Elizabeth Betsy Abel, were both deceased. Other living relatives were located and confirmed through additional DNA testing. On December 8, 2022, at a televised press conference, Philadelphia Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw and medical examiner Dr. Constance D'Angelo formally announced Joseph's name to the world. Standing beside them were the detectives who had spent years piecing together his story. The announcement was careful, not triumphant. Officials emphasized that identifying Joseph was only one part of the case. The larger mystery remained. Who had hurt this child, and why? Investigators said they had strong suspicions about who may have been involved in Joseph's death. However, they declined to release those details publicly, citing the need for verifiable evidence. With the passage of time, many potential witnesses and persons of interest were no longer alive. Others may still be living but unwilling to talk. Still, Authorities hoped the release of Joseph's name would trigger memories from those who lived in Philadelphia in the 1950s. Neighbors, classmates, or community members who may have seen something and stayed silent. The details surrounding Joseph's life remain scarce. What is known is that he suffered. His body bore surgical scars on his ankle and groin, suggesting previous medical care. His hair had been cut, his fingernails trimmed, possibly after his death, an act investigators interpreted as an attempt to conceal his identity. The lack of a missing person report over all these years suggested deliberate erasure. Whether Joseph lived with his parents, was passed between households, or existed on the edges of a fractured family remains part of the open investigation. The confirmation of his identity was a triumph of science and persistence, but it was also a reminder of the limits of justice when time becomes the biggest obstacle. Still, the team behind the investigation remains committed. Detectives continue to receive and follow up on tips. Forensic experts are reanalyzing the evidence box, including the blanket and the cardboard, using newer methods to recover trace biological material. For the city of Philadelphia, Joseph's name has transformed a decades-old case from tragedy into remembrance. At Ivy Hill Cemetery, where he was reinterred in 1998, a new headstone now bears his full name, Joseph Augustus Zarelli. Hundreds of people gathered for a memorial following the identification, many of whom had never known the boy, but had cared for him in spirit for decades. They laid flowers, lit candles, and left handwritten notes. One read simply, "We never forgot you." Joseph's case remains one of the oldest active child death investigations in the United States. While his name has been restored, his story is still unfinished. Authorities are asking the public, especially older Philadelphians, to think back, to remember if they ever knew a child who disappeared without a word, or heard whispers of something that didn't feel right in their neighborhood. Because now, there is a name, there is a birthday, and for the first time since 1957, there is a path forward, not just for closure, but for justice. If you or someone you know has any information related to the 1957 death of Joseph Augustus Zarelli, contact the Philadelphia Police Cold Case Unit at 215-686-3334 or submit a tip online at phillypolice.com. Where are you watching from? Drop your locations in the comments below. If you made it to this point, drop your comment with "I am still here." Let's see who is still watching. Case 2. The murder of Sharon Marshall, Suzanne Savakis, USA. She died under a name that wasn't hers. Her identity was buried beneath decades of lies, forged documents, and a man who rewrote her life to fit his needs. For years, she was known as Tanya Hughes. Before that, Sharon Marshall. But long before any of those names, she was a missing little girl named Suzanne Marie Savakis, stolen, manipulated, and ultimately silenced. This isn't just the story of a cold case. It's the unraveling of one man's decades-long control over a life he never should have had access to. On April 30th, 1990, a young woman was found unconscious near the side of a road in Oklahoma City. Scattered around her were spilled groceries. She had no ID, and the man who accompanied her, Franklin Delano Floyd, claimed she had been struck by a passing vehicle while walking home. The woman was rushed to Baptist Medical Center, but the injuries she sustained were grave. Medical professionals noted a large blunt injury at the base of her skull and widespread bruising not entirely consistent with a typical pedestrian impact. She never regained consciousness. Within 24 hours, she was pronounced dead. On the hospital paperwork, her name was recorded as Tanya Hughes. Floyd identified himself as her husband, yet no immediate family appeared. No one came to claim her body besides the man who had been with her. The death, initially investigated as a potential hit and run, quickly raised red flags among detectives. Franklin Floyd's behavior was erratic. He was evasive in interviews and refused to allow any form of public obituary or funeral. Within days of her burial, he withdrew her young son from foster care and disappeared entirely. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and authorities began to suspect that the man's relationship to the woman wasn't what he claimed. Franklin Delano Floyd was already known to law enforcement. His criminal record stretched back to the 1960s and included kidnapping, assault, fraud, and repeated attempts to evade justice. But his most chilling crime wasn't what he had done to strangers. It was what he had done to someone he raised as a daughter, then later passed off as his wife. In the early 1970s, Floyd had briefly married a woman named Sandra Brandenburg, who had 4 children. When she was jailed for a minor offense, Floyd took the opportunity to flee and took all 4 children with him. 3 were eventually located, but the oldest, Suzanne, vanished. Over the next 15 years, Floyd raised Suzanne under multiple false names, moving her across state lines, enrolling her in different schools, and creating a network of fabricated identities. He presented himself as her father, then her guardian, and eventually her spouse. As a teenager, Suzanne was forced to live a life of compliance and silence, unable to reveal her true past because it had been erased. By the time she was in her late teens, Suzanne was living in Oklahoma under the alias Sharon Marshall. Despite the chaos around her, she was intelligent and driven. Friends from high school described her as gifted in science, particularly aerospace engineering, and she even earned a college scholarship. But she never made it to university. Floyd, controlling every aspect of her life, forced her into a darker world, one where she worked in adult entertainment and lived under his direct supervision. In the late 1980s, she gave birth to a son, Michael Hughes. Official documents listed Floyd as the father, though this was never confirmed biologically. Those close to Suzanne said she was a loving mother and fiercely protective of Michael. However, her relationship with Floyd remained tense and opaque. By 1990, when she died under the name Tanya Hughes, she had spent most of her life in a prison built by someone else, a prison of false names, altered documents, and controlled movements. Although Floyd was never formally charged in Suzanne's death, his criminal behavior escalated in the years following her burial. In 1994, he abducted Michael Hughes from his elementary school at gunpoint. By that time, Michael had been placed in foster care, and a court was moving to sever Floyd's parental rights due to his criminal background. On the day of the abduction, Floyd forced the school principal to escort him to Michael's classroom and took the boy. He fled the scene in a stolen vehicle and disappeared for months. The FBI eventually captured Floyd in Louisville, Kentucky, but Michael was no longer with him. For years, Floyd insisted that the child was alive and safe. But in 2014, during a federal interview, he finally confessed. Michael had been killed the same day. His remains were never located. Investigators also linked Floyd to another crime, the 1989 death of Cheryl Ann Comesso, a former co-worker of Suzanne's at a Florida club. Her body was discovered in 1995, and photographs recovered from a car Floyd had abandoned years earlier tied him directly to the scene. In 2002, he was convicted of Cheryl's murder and sentenced to death. Through all of this, one question remained. Who was the woman Floyd called Tanya, Sharon, or Monica? Who had died alone on that roadside in 1990? The answer came through a combination of investigative journalism and forensic science. Reporter Matt Birkbeck, author of A Beautiful Child and Finding Sharon, kept the case alive through years of research. He uncovered inconsistencies in Floyd's stories and helped renew public interest in Suzanne's story. In 2014, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children reopened the identity investigation using DNA. Through analysis and matching, they confirmed that the woman buried as Tanya Hughes was in fact Suzanne Marie Savakis, born in 1969, the missing child from the Brandenburg family who had vanished in the 1970s. Her siblings, who had spent decades not knowing what happened to their sister, were finally given answers. Floyd remained on death row in Florida until January 2023, when he died of natural causes. He was never brought to trial for Suzanne's death. But to the investigators who pursued the truth, and to the family who never stopped searching, Floyd's manipulation and control made one thing clear: Suzanne's life was stolen from the moment he took her. The 2022 Netflix documentary Girl in the Picture introduced millions to Suzanne's story. Through interviews, FBI files, and archived footage, it painted a portrait of a young woman whose identity was stripped away, and of the predator who orchestrated it all. Suzanne's name was taken. Her voice was silenced. her truth was buried under decades of lies. But through science, persistence, and the refusal to let her disappear, she was finally recognized. In the end, she wasn't just another cold case. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's mother. And now, someone the world finally knows by name. If you have any information about long-term missing children or unresolved identity cases, contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-THE-LOST or visit www.missingkids.org. Case 3. Bear Brook Murders. Terry Rasmussen, USA. It started with a rusted barrel in the woods. On November 10, 1985, a hunter walking through Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, spotted something out of place. Inside the metal drum were the remains of a woman and a young girl, wrapped, packed, and left to decay just off the main trail. The discovery made headlines, but without names, leads, or known local disappearances, the case soon grew cold. It would take another 15 years, and a second barrel found near the same site, to reignite the investigation. This time, it held 2 more young girls. The barrels became symbols of mystery, silent graves hiding not just the victims' identities, but the predators as well. There were no missing persons reports that matched, no clear connection between the children, no witnesses. Investigators were left chasing shadows. For decades, the 4 victims were known only by their composite sketches and estimated ages. They were not just unidentified, they were unclaimed. The breakthrough didn't come from a tip or a confession. It came from science, more specifically, from genetic genealogy. The process involved comparing DNA from the remains to public databases of family trees and ancestry results. With patience and precise research, authorities began building out the branches, slowly climbing backward from distant relatives until they could name the dead. By 2019, the woman was identified as Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch, born in 1954, and last seen in La Puente, California, in 1978. One of the children was Marie Vaughn, born in 1971, Marlise's eldest daughter. The second girl was Sarah McWaters, born in 1977, Marlise's youngest. But the fourth girl, found in the second barrel with Sarah, was different. She didn't match the Honeychurch bloodline, yet her DNA pointed directly to the man who had vanished with Marlise that Thanksgiving in 1978. His name was Terry Rasmussen, and she was his biological daughter. Rasmussen was already in prison when his secret life began to unravel. He had been convicted in 2003 for the death of Unsolved Jun, a California woman he had been dating under the alias Larry Vanner. Her remains were discovered dismembered and concealed in his home. For that crime, he received 15 years to life. In 2010, he died behind bars without ever confessing to anything else. But in death, he was finally caught. Using DNA from one of Rasmussen's children from a prior marriage, investigators confirmed that Larry Vanner, the man who killed Unsolved Jun, was also Bob Evans, a drifter once living in New Hampshire. That name was already known to authorities. It had been connected to the missing person case of Denise Baudin, a woman who vanished in 1981 along with her infant daughter. Denise was never seen again, but her child was later abandoned by Rasmussen at a trailer park in California. This was when the picture began to take shape. Terry Rasmussen wasn't just a murderer. He was a man who used identities like disposable gloves. Bob Evans, Curtis Kimball, Jerry Mockerman, Gordon Jensen, and Larry Vanner. Each alias came with a different location, a different job, and usually a different woman. Law enforcement dubbed him the Chameleon Killer because of how easily he changed faces, homes, and histories. But underneath the disguises, one pattern repeated. Vulnerable women and children disappeared after getting close to him. Many had no family who kept up with them. Some had left town quietly. Others, like Marlise Honeychurch, had a falling out with relatives and simply vanished from the family tree, until DNA brought them back. With Rasmussen confirmed as the father of the unidentified fourth girl, authorities launched another search for her mother. They believed her name was Pepper Reed, a woman born in 1952 who had once been in a relationship with Rasmussen. She too had disappeared sometime in the late 1970s. As of 2025, her body has not been located, and she remains missing. But investigators strongly suspect she was one more in the long list of lives silenced by the man who couldn't stop running. What made the Bear Brook case stand out wasn't just the horror of the crime. It was the sheer complexity. Multiple identities, multiple states, victims without names, a killer who kept changing them. And yet, what broke the case wasn't a dramatic trial or a lucky witness. It was the slow, painstaking work of matching genes, building family trees, and waiting for the science to catch up to the lies. The work was led in part by Barbara Ray Venter, the same genealogist who helped crack the Golden State Killer case. Her efforts, and those of the New Hampshire State Police, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and multiple labs, led to what may be the most complex identification sequence in cold case history. For the families, the news came like a storm. In 2020, relatives of Marlies Honeychurch and her daughters were finally able to lay them to rest. A ceremony was held in California. There were flowers, tears, and gravestones carved with their names, no longer Jane Doe's. For years they had been mourned as missing. Now they were remembered as lost and found. But there was no justice to serve. Rasmussen was already dead. No courtroom, no confession, no answers to the questions only he could have given. Why did he kill them? Where did he hide Denise Baudin? What became of Pepper Reed? Only silence remains. Bear Brook didn't just reveal one man's crimes. It changed the way cold cases are solved. It showed that forgotten victims could speak again, if someone was willing to listen closely enough. It proved that even when a name is lost, DNA remembers. And it reminded us of one chilling truth. Sometimes the most dangerous killers are the ones who know how to disappear into our lives without ever raising suspicion. Case 4. Mary Sullivan, the final victim of the Boston Strangler. Just days into the new year of 1964, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan walked into an apartment at 44A Charles Street in Boston's Beacon Hill district, carrying the hope of fresh beginnings. She had just moved from Cape Cod, full of promise and expectation. By that evening, her life would end, and the city would awaken to a nightmare. A neatly made bed, a Happy New Year card laid at her feet, and a disturbing crime that would become one of the most infamous in American history. Mary's apartment was discovered on January 4th. What law enforcement uncovered was deeply unsettling. She had been attacked, and signs of assault were present. A dark stocking had been used to harm her, and a pink silk scarf remained around her neck. Seminal fluid and other biological evidence were found on her and on a blanket, and, in a rare moment of foresight, preserved by investigators for future use. Authorities quickly concluded she was the last known victim in a series of 13 murders that would come to be associated with the name Boston Strangler, a figure who had instilled terror in single women across Boston during the early 1960s. Soon after, a man named Albert DeSalvo confessed to being the Boston Strangler. But despite admitting to all 13 murders, including Mary's, he was never charged with any of them. The confession itself raised eyebrows. It was given while he was already incarcerated for unrelated crimes and was largely uncorroborated by physical evidence. Many law enforcement officials, journalists, and Mary Sullivan's own family questioned whether DeSalvo was telling the truth or simply seeking notoriety. Over time, the uncertainty surrounding his role in the killings became its own mystery. Mary's nephew, Casey Sherman, carried that uncertainty for decades. He became an author, researcher, and public advocate, determined to bring clarity to a case that had defined his family's pain. In the early 2000s, he pressed for Mary's case to be reopened. Thanks to his efforts, the preserved evidence from her apartment was submitted for modern testing. Early results were inconclusive. In fact, some analysts suggested the samples might not match DeSalvo at all. Doubts deepened, but forensic science kept advancing. By 2013, a new method using Y chromosome DNA, which is passed directly from father to son, allowed investigators to make a breakthrough. Samples from the crime scene were compared to a living relative of DeSalvo. The result was staggering. The probability that the DNA belonged to someone other than a male in the DeSalvo family line was just 1 in 220 billion. This allowed authorities to pursue something once unthinkable: a court-ordered exhumation of Albert DeSalvo's remains for a direct match. DeSalvo's body was exhumed in July 2013. DNA extracted from his femur and teeth matched the preserved biological evidence from Mary's apartment, with a confidence level well beyond reasonable doubt. Finally, after nearly 50 years, investigators publicly confirmed that Albert DeSalvo was the man responsible for Mary Sullivan's death. The case, for decades tangled in confusion and conspiracy, had one definitive truth: Mary's killer had been named, and now scientifically proven. Still, the confirmation raised new questions. While DeSalvo's involvement in Mary's murder was no longer disputed, there remained no forensic evidence tying him to the other 12 murders he had confessed to. Some detectives, criminologists, and members of the public continued to believe that the Boston Strangler may not have been one person at all, but rather a label used to group multiple unrelated crimes. The pattern of the victims, their ages, and the methods used varied, and not all of the murders fit a clear signature. DeSalvo's confession, some argued, may have been partially fabricated. Regardless, for the Sullivan family, there was a sense of resolution. Casey Sherman publicly stated that, while the outcome was painful, it allowed Mary's voice, silenced for so long, to be heard. Her sister Diane, who was just 17 years old when Mary died, had lived with the horror for half a century. For her and others, the news brought long-delayed answers and the ability to speak about Mary not just as a victim, but as a young woman whose life had finally been acknowledged with truth. The Mary Sullivan case also highlighted the importance of evidence preservation. In 1964, DNA technology didn't exist, but detectives had the foresight to collect and store samples that would one day speak louder than any confession. The successful use of Y-DNA in this case marked a turning point for cold case investigations across the country. It reinforced how science, combined with persistence, could reach across decades to solve what once felt unsolvable. Today, the address at 44A Charles Street remains standing, but for many, it has become a symbol of both loss and perseverance. Some true crime historians and legal experts cite the case as one of the most compelling arguments for the continued funding of forensic cold case units. Others see it as a cautionary tale about the limits of confessions without corroborating evidence. But for Mary's loved ones, it is deeply personal. Her name, once buried under headlines about the Boston Strangler, now stands apart. She is no longer just the final victim. She is Mary Sullivan, and she was finally given back her story. Mary came to Boston with hope in her heart and her whole life ahead of her. A predator took that away. But justice, though delayed, finally found her. Her memory lives on, not as a footnote to a serial case, but as the reason we keep asking questions, keep preserving the truth, and never let time silence the names of the lost. Case 5. The Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo. For decades, he was a phantom, a man who terrorized entire communities, slipping away unseen after each attack, leaving behind shattered lives and no trace of who he truly was. He was known by many names: the Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the Original Night Stalker, but law enforcement and survivors would come to know him by one chilling title: the Golden State Killer. Between 1974 and 1986, California lived in fear. From Sacramento to Orange County, dozens of neighborhoods became hunting grounds. The attacks followed a disturbing pattern. Homes were broken into, couples were separated and restrained, and in many cases, lives were forever changed. Despite the scale and frequency, no suspect was ever identified. Different jurisdictions worked separate leads, unaware that they were chasing the same predator. The case went cold for decades, but the pain didn't. For the victims who survived, and for the families who didn't get that chance, time brought no healing. Their trauma lingered, unanswered and unresolved. That is, until a revolutionary method gave voice to the evidence that had long been silent. On April 24, 2018, in a quiet neighborhood in Citrus Heights, California, 72-year-old Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested outside his home. The man once sworn to uphold the law as a police officer was now accused of being the very monster who had spent 13 years terrorizing the state. His arrest wasn't the result of a tip or a confession. It came from science. Investigative genetic genealogy, a method virtually unheard of just a few years earlier, allowed authorities to trace DNA collected from crime scenes to a distant relative listed on a public genealogy database. From there, a family tree was built, one that pointed unmistakably to D'Angelo. The breakthrough was historic. It was the first time investigative genetic genealogy had been used to identify a suspect in such a large-scale, decades-old case. It connected dozens of attacks, burglaries, and homicides that had never been fully linked. More importantly, it gave survivors and families something they hadn't had in over 40 years: a name. In June 2020, D'Angelo stood in court and pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping to commit robbery. As part of the plea deal, he also publicly admitted to 161 uncharged offenses, including numerous home invasions and attacks, for which the statute of limitations had expired. The sheer volume of his admissions stunned the court. The sentencing, held in August 2020, marked a long-awaited reckoning. D'Angelo was sentenced to 11 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus 8 additional years. Now 78, he was transferred to the California State Prison in Corcoran, where he remains in the Protective Housing Unit, an area designated for inmates whose notoriety puts their safety at risk in the general population. In court, victims and their families finally had the chance to confront the man who had haunted them for so long. One woman told him, "You stole my voice, but today, I take it back." Another said, "You didn't just break into our home, you broke everything we were." Their statements were raw, courageous, and deeply human. These weren't just names on paper. They were people who had waited their entire adult lives for justice. D'Angelo said nothing as they spoke. When it was finally his turn, he stood, leaned into the microphone, and mumbled a short statement. "I've listened to all your statements, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt." The apology was emotionless. No tears, no remorse. Just a final act in a long, twisted performance. But justice didn't come through emotion. It came through facts. The DNA evidence was conclusive. The timelines matched. The details only the perpetrator could know were now coming directly from the man who committed them. And for many families, the courtroom brought an ending, not to the grief, but to the uncertainty. The Golden State Killer case wasn't just a breakthrough because of the arrest. It was a turning point for the entire field of forensic investigation. It showed that even the most elusive predators could be caught, even after decades. It sparked new hope for hundreds of other cold cases across the country, and it ushered in a new era where science could outpace silence. The case also renewed public interest in criminal justice reform, victim advocacy, and the power of investigative journalism. Michelle McNamara, the late author and researcher who spent years compiling details on the Golden State Killer under the moniker ER-ONS, brought public focus back to the case through her blog and her book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark. While she passed away before D'Angelo's arrest, her work played a vital role in keeping the story alive and pushing for answers. What Joseph James D'Angelo left behind was more than a criminal record. He left behind a trail of broken lives, traumatized families, and unanswered questions about how someone entrusted with a badge and a gun could become one of the most prolific serial offenders in American history. But what his victims left behind is even more powerful: a legacy of strength, of survival, and of refusing to be forgotten. Today, Joseph D'Angelo remains behind bars, stripped of his anonymity and exposed for what he truly was. He will never walk free again. His legacy isn't power. It's not fear. It's being caught. Late, but caught. And for many, that's enough. Because sometimes, the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it's found in a database, in a lab, in a box of old evidence. And when science catches up, even the coldest of cases can still burn with truth. Case 6. Phyllis Baylor, 1972, USA. On a warm summer evening in July 1972, 26-year-old Phyllis Baylor packed up her car with the kind of calm that comes from routine. She and her 3-year-old daughter were on their way from Indianapolis to Bluffton, Indiana, a drive she had made many times before. It was supposed to be just a few quiet hours on the road to see her parents. But by the next morning, Phyllis never arrived, and her name would become a haunting mystery buried for over 50 years, until science gave her family the answer they never stopped waiting for. Her abandoned car was discovered the next day along Interstate 69 in Allen County. It was stopped along the shoulder, doors locked, no sign of struggle. Yet something was clearly wrong. A few hours later, the young mother's body was found in a roadside ditch nearby. She had suffered fatal injuries. Her toddler was found in the vehicle, miraculously unharmed, strapped in the back seat. Too young to explain what happened. Too young to understand that her mother wouldn't be coming back. The case stunned local law enforcement. For weeks, detectives followed every lead they could find. But it was 1972, long before the invention of DNA profiling, and years before digital databases existed. Physical evidence was sparse. Witnesses were few. And though a suspect was questioned early on, a lack of proof left investigators with no way forward. Eventually, the case grew cold. Decades passed. The daughter grew up, carrying the weight of a story no child should have to live with. Investigators never forgot Phyllis, but leads dried up and time kept moving. Then, in 2000, DNA testing had finally reached a stage where older cases could be revisited. The evidence from 1972 was reprocessed, producing a partial genetic profile. It helped eliminate the original suspect. Still, it wasn't enough to reveal the person responsible. In 2024, the Indiana State Police Laboratory partnered with Identifinders International, a private forensic genealogy company known for solving long-dormant cases. This time, the team managed to build a complete DNA profile from evidence recovered decades ago. Using public genealogy databases and advanced bioinformatics, investigators began the process of reverse engineering a family tree, starting from fragments of genetic code and working backwards to identify who matched it. By early 2025, they had a name: Fred Allen Lieneman. At the time of Phyllis's murder, Lieneman was 25 years old. He had a prior criminal record, including arrests for theft and burglary, but no history of violent crime. He wasn't on anyone's radar in 1972, and there was no known connection between him and Phyllis. Investigators now believe the two may have crossed paths by chance. Phyllis's car is thought to have overheated or broken down on the interstate. It's believed she accepted a ride from Lieneman, hoping to get help for her child. It was a moment of trust, and that moment cost her everything. Lieneman died in Detroit in 1985, murdered during an unrelated incident. That meant there would be no arrest, no courtroom, no trial. But authorities made it clear, if Lieneman had been alive, he would have faced charges based on the DNA match and supporting evidence. The announcement came with a bittersweet tone: justice, in name only. Still, for Phyllis's daughter, now in her 50s, the resolution meant something deeper than a prosecution ever could. For her, it meant no more guessing. No more nights spent wondering who did it or why. She had lived her life with a wound no one could see, a quiet absence only she truly understood. "My mother's story has lived in silence for too long," she said in a statement. "Now, I can say her name with truth, not mystery." The case also marked another major win for forensic genetic genealogy in the United States. What began with a DNA fragment in an old evidence locker turned into a family tree, which turned into a suspect, which finally brought a name to the unknown. The method used in Phyllis's case is the same process that helped identify the Golden State Killer in California, and it continues to rewrite how cold cases are solved across the country. Authorities praised the teamwork involved, from state lab technicians and cold case detectives to the genealogists at Identifinders. They also acknowledged the patience and strength of Phyllis's family, who waited more than half a century for an answer. This was a case that haunted the department. One Indiana State police officer said, "We didn't give up, and neither did her family." It's difficult to put closure into words when so much time has passed. The road to Bluffton that July evening never saw Phyllis Baylor arrive. But thanks to science, determination, and time catching up with the truth, her story did. Today, her daughter can finally look at a photograph of her mother and no longer ask, "Who did this?" She can say the name of the man responsible. and she can say it with certainty. For some families, that's not just justice, it's peace. Case 7. The murder of Melanie White, 1994, Las Vegas, USA. In the late summer of 1994, Las Vegas was bursting with tourists, neon dreams, and a heat that pressed against everything. But just beyond the city's glittering lights, in the vast and quiet stretch of desert near Lake Mead, two hikers made a grim discovery that would echo through decades. The body of 27-year-old Melanie White was found at the bottom of a dusty wash, partially concealed in a dirt turnout near the entrance to the Lake Mead recreation area. It was clear she had met with violence. The scene, isolated and disturbing, offered little in the way of immediate answers. Melanie White was a mother, a sister, and a daughter who had recently moved to Las Vegas in search of a fresh start. She arrived that spring with her boyfriend, unsure of what came next, but hopeful that something in this city might lead to stability. Friends and family say she was trying to put her life back together, juggling jobs, raising her son, and looking for direction. She was kind, she was trying, she mattered, and her sudden death left a void that would never quite close. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department launched an immediate investigation. Detectives canvassed the area, spoke with known associates, and combed through Melanie's recent activity. They found no witnesses, no weapon, and no clear motive. While tire tracks and physical evidence were collected, no arrests were made. Her case soon joined a growing list of unresolved files, pushed to the back of a cabinet, marked Unsolved, and quietly shelved as years passed. In 2010, advances in forensic science gave investigators a new chance to revisit the case. Cold case detectives with LVMPD re-examined the preserved evidence. They developed a male DNA profile from the crime scene and uploaded it into the National CODIS database. But there was no match. Whoever left that genetic fingerprint behind had never been arrested or convicted for a qualifying crime. Once again, the trail ran cold. It would take over a decade more before technology could bridge the gap. In 2021, the Vegas Justice League, a nonprofit focused on unsolved crimes, stepped in. They partnered with Othram Labs, a Texas-based forensic laboratory known for pioneering work in forensic genetic genealogy. Using the preserved DNA profile, Othram built a family tree, tracing relatives and narrowing the scope through public records, obituaries, and ancestry databases. In August 2024, nearly 30 years after Melanie's murder, the name finally surfaced: Arthur Joseph Lavery. Lavery had lived in Las Vegas in 1994 and attended high school in the area. He had a prior arrest on record, but nothing that tied him directly to Melanie. No known friendship, no workplace connection, no shared social circle. Investigators believe it was a chance encounter that turned fatal. After leaving Nevada, Lavery relocated to California, where he lived out the rest of his life quietly. In 2021, he died from heart complications related to COVID-19. He was never interviewed, never confronted, and now never will be. At a press conference in October 2024, Melanie's now-grown son stood alongside detectives and supporters from the Vegas Justice League. The room was quiet as he spoke. He thanked the team who never gave up and the people who donated time and money to make the DNA work possible. For years, he had lived with the question of who and why. Now, he had an answer, even if it didn't come with a trial or a verdict. While the man responsible won't face justice in a courtroom, the truth has finally been named. And for Melanie's family, that matters. It doesn't undo the loss, and it doesn't fill the silence left behind, but it honors her memory. It reminds us that some cases don't stay buried forever, not if the right people keep digging. Case 8. The murder of Danielle Houchins, 1996, Montana, USA. Danielle "Danny" Houchins was only 15 years old when her life ended under tragic and unexplained circumstances in Belgrade, Montana. On the morning of September 21st, 1996, she left home following a disagreement with her mother, just to clear her head. Her pickup truck was later discovered abandoned at the Cameron Bridge fishing access site near the Gallatin River. Hours passed with no sign of her, and by nightfall, fear had gripped her family. That same night, family friends searching the area stumbled upon her body in a shallow, marshy part of the river. The teenager had been dragged and hidden, her final moments lost in silence and confusion. Initial findings only deepened the family's heartbreak. The coroner's report cited the manner of death as undetermined, despite clear signs that Danielle had been harmed. Authorities noted evidence that she had been attacked and left in the water, but without a named suspect or direct witness. The case quickly grew cold. Hair samples and other biological material were recovered from the scene. But in 1996, DNA testing lacked the sophistication it has today. The forensic trail went quiet, and over the years, so did public attention. Danielle's family, however, never stopped seeking justice. Her sister, Stephanie Mollett, became the voice that refused to let the case fade. For more than 2 decades, she pushed for answers, speaking to the media, contacting investigators, and reminding the world that Danny mattered. Despite the long silence from law enforcement, the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office never formally closed the case. In 2019, a cold case team reopened the investigation, this time equipped with more advanced forensic tools, particularly forensic genetic genealogy. Investigators reanalyzed the preserved DNA evidence and uploaded it to genealogical databases, which help law enforcement identify suspects through family trees rather than direct criminal matches. The breakthrough came when a partial match led to extended relatives of a man named Paul Hutchinson, who had been a student at Montana State University in 1996. The more the detectives looked into his background, the more it aligned with the timeline and location of the crime. Hutchinson had no criminal history. He was a husband, a father, and by all accounts, had lived an ordinary life in the years since. In July 2024, authorities approached Hutchinson, who was then working for the Bureau of Land Management. During the interview, Hutchinson appeared visibly shaken. He was cooperative, but nervous. Within hours of speaking with investigators, Hutchinson was found deceased from what officials described as self-inflicted injuries. In the aftermath of his death, the forensic lab confirmed that his DNA was a complete match to the evidence collected from Danielle's scene 28 years earlier. The case was formally closed shortly after. The identification of Hutchinson brought both relief and anguish. Relief that the truth had finally emerged. Anguish that justice would never play out in a courtroom. For Danielle's family, it was a resolution they had waited half a lifetime to receive. Stephanie Mollett, who had carried her sister's memory in every press interview and public plea, expressed gratitude that the case was no longer a mystery. She also spoke of the weight of those lost years, the birthdays, holidays, and ordinary moments that would never be shared. Authorities later stated that Danielle and Hutchinson had no known relationship. They believed the attack was random, a tragic encounter between a vulnerable teenager and someone willing to take advantage of opportunity. Law enforcement is now reviewing other cold cases in Montana and surrounding states, assessing whether Hutchinson may be connected to other unsolved crimes. While no direct links have been confirmed, the reopening of Danielle's case has inspired renewed attention to older files once thought to be unsolvable. Danielle Hutchins was more than a case file. She was a teenager navigating the challenges of adolescence, full of energy and growing into herself. Though her life was cut short, her story became a turning point for how small departments like Gallatin counties can leverage modern forensic science. Her family's persistence, paired with advancements in technology, ensured that her case would not remain in the shadows. Today, her story stands as both a tragedy and a breakthrough, a reminder that time may bury the truth, but persistence and science can still unearth it. What began as an unresolved disappearance on a quiet Montana morning finally ended with an answer. And while it will never undo the loss, it gave Danielle's family something they had waited nearly 3 decades to hear: the truth. If you or someone you know is struggling, you are not alone. In the U.S., you can call or text 988 for free, confidential support. Case 9. The murders of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky, 1956, Montana, USA. It began as a simple date night in a small Montana town. On January 2, 1956, 18-year-old airman Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and 16-year-old high school student Patricia Kalitsky left Pete's drive-in in Great Falls for an evening drive. They were young, happy, and full of promise. 2 bright lives on the threshold of adulthood. But by morning, both would be gone, and a mystery would grip the state for more than 6 decades. Lloyd was stationed at nearby Malmstrom Air Force Base, known for his discipline and easy charm. Patricia was a top student at Great Falls High, well-liked and ambitious, with dreams of becoming a teacher. They had been dating for months, and everyone who knew them said their relationship was pure and joyful. After their stop at the drive-in, the couple drove out toward Wadsworth Park, a quiet area along the Sun River, known locally as a place for privacy and stargazing. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. The following day, January 3rd, 3 young boys exploring the riverbank made a discovery that would shock Great Falls to its core. Near a parked car with the headlights still on and the radio humming softly, they found the lifeless body of Airman Bogle. His hands were tied behind his back with his own belt, and he had sustained a gunshot wound to the head. There were no signs of theft. His wallet and personal belongings were untouched. The engine still ran as if time itself had stopped in that spot. For investigators, the scene raised more questions than answers. Who would target a young couple with no enemies? And why leave behind valuables if the motive wasn't robbery? As officers combed the area, a far grimmer discovery awaited them. The next morning, January 4th, a county road worker noticed something strange about 5 miles north of the first crime scene. In a secluded patch of open land, he found Patricia's body. She, too, had been shot in the head. The medical examiner concluded she had suffered before death, though precise details were carefully documented rather than publicized. For the people of Cascade County, the sense of safety that had defined small-town life evaporated overnight. The Great Falls Police Department and Cascade County Sheriff's Office launched an extensive investigation. Officers interviewed military personnel from Malmstrom Air Force Base, questioned locals, and even followed leads across state lines. At least a dozen suspects were brought in for questioning over the years, including several well-known criminals who happened to pass through the area around that time. Among them were organized crime figure James Whitey Bulger and later serial killer Edward Wayne Edwards. Each was eventually ruled out. The lack of physical evidence and the limitations of 1950s forensic science made progress nearly impossible. Still, not everything was lost. During Patricia's autopsy, pathologists had preserved microscopic evidence on a glass slide, an act of meticulous record-keeping that would later change everything. For decades, that slide sat sealed in storage, overlooked but not forgotten. In 2001, as forensic DNA technology advanced, a team re-examined the evidence. They discovered a foreign sperm cell that did not belong to Lloyd Bogle. For the first time, science confirmed that another man had been present during the crime. Yet, without a name or a match in any database, the trail went cold once more. Fast forward to 2019. Across the country, cold cases were being solved using a revolutionary tool known as forensic genetic genealogy, the same method that caught the Golden State Killer. Investigators in Cascade County decided to take a chance. They uploaded the decades-old DNA profile to a public genealogy database, allowing expert genealogists to begin building a family tree from distant relatives. It was an intricate process of elimination, requiring patience and precision. After months of careful work, the genetic links converged on one man, Kenneth Gould. At the time of the murders, Gould was 29 years old, a husband, father of 4, and horse trainer living just a mile from Patricia's home. He had no criminal record and had never been interviewed by police. What stood out was what he did next. Within weeks of the murders, Gould abruptly sold his property and moved his family out of Montana. Over the following years, he relocated several times, eventually settling in Missouri. He died there in 2007, never having faced suspicion or questioning. Investigators contacted his surviving children, who agreed to provide DNA samples. When the results came back, the conclusion was irrefutable. The genetic match between Gould's lineage and the evidence preserved from Patricia's autopsy was exact. After 65 years, the mystery was solved. In June 2021, the Cascade County Sheriff's Office held a press conference announcing the resolution of The case. The community listened in silence as Sheriff Jesse Slaughter detailed the findings. He emphasized that Gould had likely acted alone and that there was no known connection between him and the victims. The motive remains unknown, perhaps a crime of opportunity, perhaps something darker that no one alive can explain. For the families of Lloyd and Patricia, the news brought a mixture of relief and heartbreak. They had spent their lives wondering who could commit such a senseless act. Patricia's surviving relatives described the identification as a long-awaited peace. Lloyd's family, too, expressed gratitude for the persistence of modern investigators who refused to let time erase the truth. The case became a symbol of both endurance and evolution. It showed how small fragments of evidence, preserved not by luck but by diligence, can one day unlock the secrets of history. It also reflected how communities carry pain silently through generations, waiting for answers that science can finally deliver. Today, the story of Lloyd and Patricia stands not only as a cautionary tale, but as a triumph of perseverance. It is a reminder that even in the most forgotten corners of the past, the truth can still be found. In 1956, Great Falls lost 2 young souls and found itself haunted by the unknown. In 2021, through the patience of investigators and the power of technology, that unknown finally had a name. After 65 years, justice was no longer a question. It was a fact written in DNA. If you or someone you know is struggling, call or text 988 in the United States for confidential 24/7 support. Case 10. The murder of Teresa Lee Scalf, 1986, Florida, USA. Lakeland, Florida, October 27, 1986. Teresa Lee Scalf was just 29 years old when her life was taken in the most tragic and unthinkable way. A registered nurse at Lakeland Regional Health Medical Center and a devoted single mother to an 8-year-old boy, Teresa was known for her compassion, diligence, and dedication to her work and family. Her patients described her as gentle. Her colleagues saw her as dependable. But her life was cut short in her own home, and for 37 years, no one knew who was responsible. That Monday morning, Teresa failed to report to work. She hadn't called in, and no one could reach her. It wasn't like her to miss a shift without notice. Concerned, her mother, Betty Scalf, went to check on her. What she discovered was something no parent should ever have to endure. Teresa was found dead inside the residence. The scene so disturbing that seasoned detectives would later call it one of the most violent in the department's memory. Authorities arrived quickly. Inside, they found evidence of a chaotic struggle. The furniture was overturned. Blood was present throughout the home. Teresa had sustained fatal injuries, and based on her defensive wounds, investigators believed she had fought fiercely to defend herself. The attack had been intense and personal. Though many details were not released publicly at the time, it was clear the violence was not random. Her son, by what can only be described as a stroke of fate, was not home when the incident occurred. From the start, detectives treated the case with urgency. Canvassing the neighborhood, they knocked on doors, collected tips, and interviewed nearby residents, including a man named Donald Douglas, who lived just behind Teresa's duplex. At the time, Douglas seemed cooperative, even helpful. He had no criminal history, nothing suspicious stood out, and he wasn't considered a threat. With no physical evidence tying him to the scene and no eyewitnesses placing him there, the investigation moved on. But there was one crucial piece of evidence left behind: blood that did not belong to Teresa. In 1986, DNA analysis was still in its infancy. Investigators preserved the sample, but for years, there was no match. The blood was entered into the National CODIS database when technology evolved, but still, no hits. Decades passed, leads dried up. The case file grew cold, quietly stored alongside others that had faded from the headlines, but never from the hearts of loved ones. It wasn't until 2022 that the case found new momentum. The Polk County Sheriff's Office, determined not to let Teresa's story end without justice, partnered with Othram Inc., a private Texas-based laboratory that specializes in forensic genetic genealogy. Their scientists analyzed the degraded DNA sample, isolated a viable profile, and used publicly available genealogical databases to search for familial links. This method, now revolutionizing how cold cases are solved, allowed experts to reverse engineer a family tree starting with distant relatives. The process is slow and meticulous, but in Teresa's case, it worked. As the tree narrowed, one name emerged: Donald Douglas, the same man who had been interviewed casually in 1986, the man who lived directly behind Teresa, the man who, for all these years, had never been a serious suspect. Investigators couldn't ask Douglas directly. He had died in 2008 of natural causes at the age of 54, but they could investigate through his children. In 2023, detectives approached Douglas's adult son and asked for a voluntary DNA sample. He agreed. The lab compared it to the crime scene evidence and reached an unshakable conclusion. The biological relationship between the sample and the DNA left at the scene was that of parent and child. The match was definitive. There was no longer any doubt. In October 2023, 37 years after the murder, the Polk County Sheriff's Office announced the case was closed. The evidence had proven that Donald Douglas was the man responsible for ending Teresa Scalf's life. For Teresa's family, especially her mother Betty, it was the news they had been waiting for and fearing for nearly 4 decades. At 37 years old, Teresa's son had lived most of his life without answers. Now, justice had arrived, albeit without the chance for a courtroom trial. Authorities publicly thanked the forensic scientists, genealogists, and dedicated officers who never gave up on the case. Sheriff Grady Judd said in a press conference, "This case could have stayed unsolved forever. But because of technology, because of perseverance, and because of the determination to never forget Teresa, we got the answer." The community of Lakeland, which had quietly carried the memory of the case for decades, expressed collective relief and gratitude. Teresa had not been forgotten. Her story had not been discarded. Her case had not been lost in time. While the suspect never faced a jury or had to answer for his actions, the resolution of the case brought a form of peace to those who loved her. Closure does not erase grief, but it does bring truth. And in cold cases, truth can be the rarest and most powerful form of justice. The Teresa Lee Scalf case stands as another testament to the power of forensic genetic genealogy. It proves that even when justice is delayed, it is not always denied. And for the families who wait decades in silence, every breakthrough is more than just science. It's hope renewed. Case 11. Baby Garnet, Michigan, 1997. In the summer of 1997, deep in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, a routine assignment revealed a secret long buried beneath the earth. On June 26, a maintenance worker at the Garnet Lake Campground in Hudson Township entered a vault toilet pit to service the facility. Hidden in the septic tank sat the remains of a full-term, or near-full-term, newborn girl. No name, no family, no home. She came to be known simply as Baby Garnet, a symbol of a community's sorrow and a case that would lie cold for decades. The discovery stunned local authorities. The infant had evidently been born alive and died by asphyxiation, according to the autopsy, which noted a gestational age of 36 to 42 weeks. The investigation that summer became exhaustive. Interviews with nearby mothers, searches through local hospital birth records, and appeals to the public. But none of those efforts produced a credible lead. As autumn gave way to winter, the file was labeled Unsolved. The child remained nameless, and the hope of resolution faded. Despite the passage of time, the case never completely vanished from memory. Community volunteers held a service for Baby Garnet. Detectives placed the file in cold case storage. The preserved evidence included some of the most critical material: the infant's skeletal remains and a biological sample that hinted at another person's involvement. In 2001, laboratory work revealed a male DNA component that did not match the unknown infant's own paternal side, and certainly did not match anyone associated with the file. Investigators concluded there was an unlinked individual, Yet without a database match, the trail stopped. The baby rested in silence, and the question of who carried her secret remained unanswered. The turning point came in the late 2010s when forensic science advanced into new terrain. In 2017, Michigan State Police detectives reopened the file and partnered with genealogical specialists. Through the process of forensic genetic genealogy, building extended family trees from distant DNA matches, they began to trace the lineage of the unknown sample. Months of painstaking work paid off when they found a living relative, a young woman named Jenna Gerwatowski. Her ancestry DNA test showed she was a half-niece of the infant known as Baby Garnet. That match pointed toward her grandmother, Nancy Ann Gerwatowski. Nancy, once a resident of Newberry, Michigan, and later living in Wyoming, had no prior public criminal record. Investigators learned that in 1997 she was in the region, and while her name never appeared in initial interviews, the genealogical profile suggested the sample at the scene belonged to her. In 2022, detectives located Nancy, and she eventually confirmed she was the child's mother. She was charged in July of that year with open murder, involuntary manslaughter, and concealing the death of an individual, a possible life sentence case. In May 2024, a judge in the 92nd District Court, St. Ignace, bound Nancy to stand trial in Mackinac County, Michigan, after reviewing the prosecutorial motion. Her defense sought to dismiss parts of the case, arguing prosecutors could not conclusively prove the baby was born alive and that certain statements should be suppressed. The court denied those early requests and moved the trial forward, acknowledging that genetic and genealogical evidence formed the core of the prosecution's case. For the region, the resolution marked a bittersweet moment of answer and reflection. The community that had mourned a nameless infant for more than 25 years could now call her baby by name. Forensic scientists praised the genealogical breakthrough. One Michigan Attorney General press release noted, "Thanks to 3 decades of persistence and scientific advancement, we are finally able to pursue justice for Baby Garnet." And for the family of Jenna Gerwatowski, the genealogy test she took for curiosity's sake turned into a link to an old secret, one they never expected to uncover. Yet the deeper questions remain. Why did Nancy act alone? What led her to conceal a newborn and move the body to a remote pit? Was this a moment of desperation, cover-up, or both? Prosecutors allege the child's death could have been prevented if medical care had been sought. They maintain the move to conceal the body was intentional. While the trial will not change history, it will test whether a society can hold someone accountable after decades, and whether truth, however delayed, still counts for justice. The Baby Garnet case is emblematic of a new era in cold case investigation. It demonstrates how preserved evidence, paired with forensic genealogy and legal collaboration, can reach across decades to reach the unknown. It also underlines an uneasy reality. Someone can carry a secret for years, but the genes we inherit may yet speak for those who cannot. As the 11th Circuit Court of Michigan prepares for trial, Baby Garnet has a place in history, not just as a victim, but as a turning point. Her name will be spoken, her story will be told, and for a family, a community, and a system, the promise that no case stays unsolved forever has been upheld. Case 12. The murder of Christine Jessup, 1984, Ontario, Canada. On October 3, 1984, 9-year-old Christine Jessup disappeared from her home in Queensville, Ontario. She had just returned from school and was last seen heading out to meet a friend in the neighborhood. That evening, when she didn't come home, her parents, Bob and Janet Jessup, reported her missing. A massive community search began, driven by hope and fear, as police and volunteers scoured woods, fields, and nearby towns. Days turned to weeks with no sign of her. Then, nearly 3 months later, on December 31st, Christine's body was discovered in a wooded area in Sunderland, about 50 kilometers away. She had been severely assaulted and murdered. The scene stunned the community and ignited one of Canada's most haunting criminal investigations. Police pressure to solve the case led to the arrest of 24-year-old Guy Paul Morin, the Jessup's neighbor. A quiet man who played the clarinet and lived with his parents, Morin was considered odd by some, but he had no criminal history. Despite minimal evidence, police and prosecutors built a case around witness inconsistencies and a now debunked timeline. He was first acquitted in 1986, but prosecutors appealed. In a second trial in 1992, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. But Moran maintained his innocence every step of the way. It wasn't until 1995 that DNA testing, which had become more advanced, definitively excluded him as the source of the evidence. His conviction was overturned, and he was fully exonerated. The wrongful conviction shook Canada's justice system. A public inquiry led by Justice Fred Kaufman revealed systemic flaws, tunnel vision by investigators, withheld evidence, and a lack of oversight. Moran had become a scapegoat for an anxious police force eager to solve a high-profile case. The inquiry's findings led to major reforms, including new guidelines on evidence disclosure and how police handle suspects. But for Moran, no apology or compensation could return the lost years. He had spent nearly a decade fighting to clear his name. For the Jessup family, the exoneration brought no peace. Their daughter's killer was still free. For years, the case remained cold, files collecting dust. Then, in 2020, Ontario's police force sent the preserved DNA sample to a U.S. lab for genealogical analysis. It was a long shot, but the technology had helped crack dozens of cold cases in recent years. Within months, the analysis pointed to Calvin Hoover, a man in his late 20s at the time of Christine's death. He wasn't a stranger. Hoover had been a family acquaintance. He and his wife had even socialized with the Jessups. He was never interviewed as a suspect during the original investigation. Hoover had died in 2015 by suicide. Still, the match was conclusive. Police publicly identified him as the killer in October 2020, bringing long-awaited answers. But the resolution was bittersweet. With Hoover deceased, there would be no trial, no confrontation, no opportunity to ask why. Still, the breakthrough marked a powerful example of justice catching up, decades later, with truth. Investigators admitted the original investigation had overlooked key leads and allowed bias to shape their focus. Christine's legacy now rests in the reforms that followed. Her case is a reminder of how easily desperation and confirmation bias can derail an investigation. It also showed the promise of modern science to correct past errors. But for her parents and for Guy Paul Morin, the scars never fully faded. A little girl was taken, an innocent man was imprisoned, and a justice system built to protect both had failed them. Case 13, the murder of Sharon Pryor, 1975, Montreal, Canada. Sharon Pryor was just 16 years old when she vanished from her neighborhood in Pointe-Saint-Charles, Montreal, on the afternoon of March 29, 1975. She had plans to meet friends at a nearby pizzeria, something she'd done many times before. But this time, she never made it. Her disappearance triggered an immediate search by her family, who knew it was out of character. Within hours, neighbors joined the effort, and the quiet community turned into a grid of concern. But as night fell, hope began to dim. Sharon's absence grew heavier by the minute, and everyone feared the worst. 3 days later, on April 1st, her body was found in a vacant lot across the river in Longueuil. She had been left in a wooded area, partially concealed from view. The medical examiner concluded that she had suffered serious physical harm and lost her life through suffocation. The discovery sent shockwaves through Montreal. Pointe-Saint-Charles, a close-knit neighborhood known for its working-class families and modest row houses, had never seen anything like this. Residents who once felt safe walking their streets now locked their doors, and parents no longer let children out of their sight. Sharon's death became one of the city's most painful tragedies. At the scene, investigators collected multiple pieces of potential evidence. Most notably, they recovered a man's t-shirt believed to have been used to restrain her. Tire marks were also recorded near the body, hinting at the type of vehicle used in her transport. Around the same time, a separate woman had reported an attempted abduction at knife point on the same street where Sharon disappeared. She provided a clear description of the man in his car. Authorities took this seriously and logged it alongside their growing list of leads. Yet despite combing through over 100 suspects and cross-referencing dozens of alibis, the investigation soon hit a wall. For decades, it stayed there. What made the case all the more frustrating was that DNA had been collected early on, but science hadn't yet caught up. The materials were preserved, meticulously stored by detectives who refused to give up. As years turned into decades, Sharon's family held on to hope, even as birthdays passed without her. Her mother, Yvonne, became a tireless advocate for cold case reform in Canada, often speaking publicly about the gaps in forensic tools that left families like hers waiting in silence. The community never forgot. Every anniversary brought new headlines, fresh reminders, and renewed calls for justice. Everything changed in June 2022. A forensic breakthrough using Y chromosome analysis allowed authorities to extract a full male DNA profile from the evidence preserved since 1975. This was a pivotal moment. The DNA sample was run through genealogical databases, and soon a family name surfaced: Romine. Investigators narrowed this to Franklin Maywood Romine, an American with a lengthy criminal history who had been living in Montreal at the time of Sharon's death. Romine wasn't just a vague match. He had previous arrests in the U.S. for serious violent crimes and had served multiple prison terms in different states. Romine had died in 1982 at the age of 36, having returned to the U.S. years earlier. But investigators weren't deterred. A team of Canadian and American authorities worked together to obtain a court order for the exhumation of Romine's body from a cemetery in West Virginia. In May 2023, the remains were carefully examined, and DNA testing confirmed the result: a 100% match to the male profile recovered from the crime scene. It wasn't just the DNA that lined up. The tire marks found in Longueuil in 1975 were consistent with a car Romine had been known to drive. The eyewitness sketch from the attempted abduction also matched his appearance. It was the answer that had taken nearly half a century to arrive. And though Franklin Romine could no longer be held accountable in court, the confirmation gave Sharon Pryor's family something they had waited a lifetime for: certainty. Investigators called the case officially solved. In a public statement, police said they were confident beyond a reasonable doubt that Romine was responsible for the crime. His violent history and presence in Montreal at the time of Sharon's disappearance solidified the link. The family, while relieved, described the news as bittersweet. There would be no trial, no formal justice. But at last, the silence had been broken. In the years since her death, Sharon's name became a symbol for the resilience of cold case families. Her mother's advocacy efforts led to new conversations in Canadian law enforcement about the preservation and re-examination of evidence. Journalists who had followed the case for decades noted that Sharon's story helped pave the way for greater public awareness about unsolved crimes and the power of forensic genealogy. It was a case that demanded attention and finally received it. What began as a mystery in a quiet neighborhood ended with one of Canada's most notable examples of science delivering long-awaited answers. Despite the resolution, questions still linger. How many more cases like Sharon's sit in boxes, waiting for technology to catch up? How many other perpetrators, long deceased, have evaded accountability due to timing and limited tools? For the Pryor family, the result was as close to justice as they could get, but it also underscored how justice delayed, while welcome, is still justice denied. Franklin Romine's name may be on the final police file, but Sharon remains the focus. A vibrant teenager whose life was cut short far too soon, now remembered not just for her loss, but for the strength her story gave to so many. Today, a plaque marks the site of her memorial in Montreal. Flowers appear there every year, sometimes from strangers who never knew her but followed the case for decades. They stop to remember a girl whose smile once lit up a local pizzeria, who should have had a lifetime ahead of her. The resolution of her case is a quiet testament to the power of persistence, family love, and modern science. It reminds us that truth has no expiration date, and that even in the darkest cases, time can still reveal the light. If you are enjoying this content, like, subscribe, and share to your loved ones to protect them from the same tragic happening to them in the future. Case 14. The murders of Susan Tice and Aaron Gilmore. Susan Tice was a 45-year-old family counselor who had recently returned to Toronto after living in Calgary. Known for her compassion and advocacy work, Susan had just settled into her modest home on Grace Street in the Bickford Park neighborhood. On August 17, 1983, when she didn't show up for work or answer calls, concerned family members went to check on her. Inside the quiet home, they made a tragic discovery. Susan had been attacked in her own bedroom. The details were devastating. She had been assaulted and, fatally injured, a victim of violence that seemed to come from nowhere. Just 4 months later, on December 20th, 1983, another call to police would send chills through the city. Erin Gilmore, a vibrant 22-year-old fashion designer and the daughter of a prominent Toronto family, was found dead in her upscale Yorkville apartment. She had also been assaulted and killed in a manner disturbingly similar to Susan. Toronto detectives were stunned. The two women came from different backgrounds, different parts of the city, and lived entirely separate lives. But the similarities were undeniable. Both killed in their homes, both found partially clothed, both with signs of restraint. The cases were immediately linked, and yet, despite public outcry, police were left with few leads. No witnesses, no arrests, just fear. For years, detectives revisited the files, following every scrap of information that came their way. In 2000, investigators took a leap forward. DNA profiles recovered from both crime scenes, once only partially usable, were now complete and matched. The same unknown man had killed both women, but that breakthrough came with frustration. The profile yielded no matches in Canada's national DNA database. Whoever he was, he had never been convicted of a crime serious enough to be in the system. Once again, the trail went cold. It would take nearly 2 more decades and a new wave of forensic science to change everything. In 2019, Toronto police partnered with Othram, a Texas-based lab that specializes in advanced forensic genealogy. Using the suspect's DNA, Othram built a detailed genetic profile and began reverse engineering a family tree, tracing second, third, and even fourth cousins through public ancestry databases. This process, called forensic genealogy, had helped solve cold cases across the US, but this was one of Canada's first. It took over 3 years of intensive mapping, cross-checking, and verification. And then, in late 2022, the work paid off. On November 28, 2022, Toronto police arrested 61-year-old Joseph George Sutherland in Moosonee, Ontario, a remote town nearly 900 kilometers north of Toronto. His DNA was an exact match to the samples recovered in both 1983 cases. The man had been just 21 years old at the time of the murders and had never been on the radar of police. He had no known link to either woman. In fact, after the killings, Sutherland quietly moved north and lived a quiet life. Married, employed, and never again charged with any serious crime. For decades, he vanished into the background of society while 2 families waited for answers. The arrest made headlines across Canada. For the families of Susan and Erin, it was a moment that felt both miraculous and surreal. They had waited 39 years. Now they were staring at the face of a man who had stolen 2 lives and evaded justice for nearly 4 decades. The legal process moved swiftly. In September 2023, Sutherland pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder. During the sentencing hearing, he offered no real explanation, no apology, only a brief statement acknowledging his guilt. The court handed down 2 concurrent life sentences, with no possibility of parole for 20 years. For Erin Gilmore's brother, Sean McCowan, the moment was bittersweet. "This is closure," he told reporters, "but it doesn't bring Erin back." The same held true for Susan's surviving relatives, who had spent their lives wondering how someone so full of empathy and care could have been taken in such a violent way. In the courtroom, family members spoke of decades lost, birthdays missed, grief unspoken, the agony of not knowing. Justice had come, but it came too late to ask the questions that still haunted them. What made the case even more disturbing was the randomness. Sutherland didn't know Susan. He didn't know Erin. He had no personal vendetta, no financial motive, no connection that could make the crimes make sense. This was opportunistic evil, predatory violence for reasons the killer himself never tried to explain. For the investigators, it was a sobering reminder of how many cold cases remain unsolved and how often answers lie just beyond the limits of current technology. Today, the cases of Susan Tice and Aaron Gilmore serve as a watershed moment in Canadian criminal justice. They were among the first major cases in the country solved using forensic genealogy, a method that is now transforming the way law enforcement approaches unsolved homicides. In the wake of this breakthrough, Canadian agencies have begun investing in partnerships with labs like Othram to revisit other cold cases, with hopes of delivering long-awaited answers to more families still stuck in the shadows. But for the Tice and Gilmore families, this story is not about science. It's about Susan and Aaron, two women who were loved, whose lives mattered, and whose deaths left a permanent scar. Their legacy now stretches beyond their families and into courtrooms, laboratories, and crime scene units across the country. In the silence that followed their murders, technology spoke, and at last, it said their names with certainty. Justice, though delayed, finally came, and with it, a truth that proves no matter how long it takes, the past can still be rewritten, not in fiction, but in fact. Case 15, The Murder. Marie Chivarella, 1964, Pennsylvania, USA. On the morning of March 18, 1964, in Hazleton, Pennsylvania, 9-year-old Maurice Ann Chivarella left her family home before school. She was carrying a box of canned food, a gift for her nun teacher in honor of the Feast of St. Joseph. Maurice was the youngest of 7 children, a bright student who took her responsibilities seriously. That morning walk to St. Joseph's parochial school was supposed to be routine, but she never arrived. Hours later, her family's growing concern turned into alarm, and soon after, a nightmare began to unfold that would haunt the town for nearly 6 decades. Later that same afternoon, a man teaching his teenage nephew how to drive through the outskirts of town spotted something unusual in an abandoned coal mining area. What he found was devastating. There, in a desolate calm bank, one of the many blackened scars left behind by Hazleton's mining past, lay the body of a young girl. Authorities confirmed it was Maurice. Her remains had been concealed in a shallow depression, her hands tied with her own shoelaces, and a scarf loosely wrapped across her face. The town froze in grief and disbelief. For families in Hazleton, the streets no longer felt safe. And for Maurice's parents and siblings, life would never return to normal. The Pennsylvania State Police launched an immediate investigation. At the time, the evidence was overwhelming in one way and painfully thin in another. There were no cameras, no reliable eyewitnesses, and although forensic science had yet to enter the DNA age, they did collect biological material from the scene and from Maurice's clothing, an act of diligence that would prove crucial decades later. Over the years, investigators interviewed neighbors, friends, former students, and local workers. But despite their efforts, the case slowly went cold. By the early 2000s, Maurice's case was one of Pennsylvania's oldest unsolved child deaths. In 2007, investigators revisited the evidence using new forensic tools. They successfully developed a DNA profile from biological material recovered from Maurice's jacket. It was a breakthrough moment, but only in theory. When they ran the profile through CODIS, the national database, there was no match. Whoever had taken Maurice's life had never been arrested for a qualifying offense or had passed away before law enforcement could collect their sample. The Chivarella family remained hopeful. Publicly and privately, they continued to speak about Maurice, preserving her memory and pushing for renewed investigation. In 2019, law enforcement took a major step forward. They uploaded the unidentified DNA profile into public genetic genealogy databases, hoping to identify distant relatives and build backwards. At the time, investigative genealogy was still a relatively new tool in law enforcement, but its success in other cold cases, such as the Golden State Killer, encouraged its use across the country. Then came the unexpected helper, Eric Schubert, a college student from New Jersey studying history and political science, who had developed a reputation for solving cold cases using genealogy. Schubert had helped resolve other family mysteries and volunteered his skills to assist the Pennsylvania State Police. In 2020, He began working with the team to build a complex family tree from distant DNA matches. Over time, the tree pointed toward a local man from the same town, someone whose name had never come up in the original investigation. That man was James Paul Fort. Forte had lived just a few blocks from the Civarella family in the 1960s. He was 22 years old at the time of Maurice's death, and though never convicted of a major crime, had been charged in the years following for unrelated incidents involving women. Forte worked as a bartender at the time and died in 1980 at the age of 38 from natural causes. Because he had never been entered into any law enforcement database, he had remained invisible to the CODIS system, until now. In early 2022, Pennsylvania authorities received permission to exhume Fort's body for comparison. The DNA sample extracted from his remains was a perfect match to the profile recovered from Maurice's clothing in 1964. The match was confirmed by multiple forensic laboratories, leaving no doubt. Nearly 58 years after her death, Maurice Ann Civarella's case was officially solved. At a press conference in February 2022, representatives from the Pennsylvania State Police, along with members of the Civarella family, spoke publicly about the resolution. While Fort would never face prosecution, the family expressed a deep sense of closure. "We have peace," one of Maurice's sisters said. "We have answers, and we know who did this to our sister." For the law enforcement community, it was a vindication of persistence and evolving technology. More than 230 state troopers had worked on the case across generations, and now it could finally be closed. The case of Maurice Ann Civarella stands as one of the oldest cold cases in the United States to be resolved through forensic genealogy. It represents a turning point in how technology can assist in solving crimes that once seemed destined to remain mysteries. But it also serves as a reminder that even when justice comes too late to be carried out in court, the truth still matters. For families like the Civarellas, truth is sometimes the only form of justice left. Today, her story is part of training manuals and law enforcement seminars across the country, not just because of how it was solved, but because of how it was never forgotten. The town of Hazleton, once shaken by her tragic loss, now carries her memory forward through community projects and educational efforts. A young girl who once set out to do a good deed on a cold March morning unknowingly became part of a story that would change how crimes are investigated forever. If you or someone you know has information about a long unsolved case, or would like to learn more about genetic genealogy in law enforcement, visit your local authorities or explore national advocacy groups dedicated to cold case support. Case 16. The Murder of Marion Crofts, 1981, Hampshire, UK. On the morning of June 6, 1981, 14-year-old Marion Crofts left her family home in Fleet, Hampshire, on her bicycle. She was headed to a youth orchestra rehearsal in nearby Farnborough, something she had done many times before. Marion was a bright, musically gifted teenager with a deep passion for playing the clarinet. That day, she followed her usual route along Laffins Road, a quiet stretch adjacent to the Basingstoke Canal. But somewhere along that path, something went terribly wrong. She never arrived at practice, and by evening, her family's worry had escalated into fear. Later that same day, a police dog handler discovered Marion's body in a wooded area near the canal. It was a secluded spot, concealed by overgrown brush and trees. Nearby, officers recovered her clarinet case floating in the water and her bicycle submerged at the canal's bottom. What had started as a normal Saturday morning quickly turned into one of Hampshire's most distressing crimes. Marion had been the target of a violent and calculated attack. Medical examiners determined that she suffered life-ending injuries caused by sustained blunt force trauma. Investigators also concluded she had been subjected to a serious indecent offense before her death. The case stunned the local community. Marion was well known and loved, a child who had never caused trouble, whose life was just beginning. The location of her attack, so close to a public path and a military garrison, made the crime even more unsettling. Investigators worked around the clock. Police canvassed the area, going door to door and speaking to more than 24,000 people. Among them were over 1,500 soldiers stationed at Aldershot Garrison, not far from the crime scene. Yet despite the scale of the effort, no solid leads emerged. The perpetrator had vanished, leaving behind no name, no face, just questions and grief. Still, authorities preserved every shred of physical evidence, from Marion's clothing to samples recovered from the crime scene, with the hope that one day scientific advances might catch what human memory and manhunts had failed to find. For more than 2 decades, Marion's case sat in limbo, cold but never forgotten. Her family endured the slow passage of time without answers. Public appeals were issued, television segments aired, but the identity of the person responsible remained hidden. Everything changed in 1999. Forensic teams re-examined the evidence using a new method known as low copy number, LCN, DNA analysis. This cutting-edge technique allowed investigators to obtain a complete DNA profile from previously unusable traces. The profile was entered into the UK's National DNA Database, but for a time, it returned no matches. The system waited, quietly, patiently, until August 2001, when the profile was automatically matched to a man recently arrested for an unrelated domestic incident. That man was Tony Jasinski, a former Lance Corporal in the British Army, who had been stationed near the crime scene in 1981. At the time of his arrest in 2001, a routine DNA swab had been taken and uploaded to the national system. The statistical certainty of the match was staggering. The odds of the DNA belonging to anyone other than Jasinski were estimated at 1 in a billion. Authorities knew they had found the man who had evaded justice for 21 years. When police approached him, Jasinski denied any involvement. He claimed the DNA evidence had been fabricated or contaminated. But the forensic trail was too solid to dispute. Investigators built a timeline placing him in proximity to the crime scene, and with the DNA evidence now linking him directly to Marion's case, he was formally charged. In April 2002, Jasinski stood trial at Winchester Crown Court. For the Crofts family, it was the beginning of long-awaited accountability, and a painful return to memories they had tried to endure in silence. The trial lasted 4 weeks. Prosecutors laid out the case in meticulous detail. The preserved DNA, the earlier military connection, and the statistical strength of the match painted a clear picture. Jasinski's defense attempted to discredit the DNA science, but experts held firm. After just 3 hours of jury deliberation, the verdict was unanimous. Jasinski was found guilty of both the assault and the killing of Marion Crofts. The judge sentenced him to life in prison. Later, while incarcerated, Jasinski reportedly admitted his actions, a final quiet acknowledgement of a truth too long denied. Marion's family had waited more than half their lives for that moment. The sense of relief, though profound, came with its own ache. No amount of justice could restore what had been taken. A life filled with promise, stolen in its prime. The case was more than just a breakthrough. It was a testament to patience, scientific advancement, and the unwavering commitment of investigators who never gave up. Beyond the courtroom, Marion's case became a cornerstone in the evolution of forensic science in the UK. It demonstrated the life-saving potential of DNA technology and the importance of preserving evidence, even when leads grow cold. Today, her story serves as both a warning and a legacy, reminding us how far we've come in the pursuit of justice and how important it is to hold on to hope, even in the darkest of cases. Case 17. The Murders of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, UK, 1986. In the small, unassuming villages of Leicestershire, England, 2 devastating crimes would spark not just grief and fear, but a revolution in criminal investigation. The tragic murders of 15-year-old Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, occurring just 3 years apart, shook the tight-knit communities of Narborough and Enderby. But what started as horrifying local tragedies would go on to change the course of global forensic science. This wasn't just a case of catching a killer. It was the moment DNA became a voice for the voiceless, revealing truth buried deeper than any footprint or fingerprint ever could. It began on the evening of November 21st, 1983. Linda Mann had told her parents she was going to visit a friend in her quiet Narborough neighborhood. When she didn't return, concern turned quickly into alarm. By morning, her body was found near a footpath known locally as 10-Pound Lane. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The news stunned the community. Police launched an extensive investigation, but despite interviewing hundreds of locals, no clear suspect emerged. With no eyewitnesses and no clear direction, the case went cold, leaving behind a grieving family and a shaken town. 3 years later, fear returned to the same region. On July 31, 1986, 15-year-old Dawn Ashworth left her home in the nearby village of Enderby. She took a shortcut along the same route where Linda had last been seen. Like Linda, Dawn never made it back. Her body was found 2 days later in a wooded area. The similarities between the two cases were striking. Same age, same path, same brutality. This wasn't just a coincidence. The police knew they were likely dealing with the same offender. In the days that followed, authorities zeroed in on a 17-year-old local boy named Richard Buckland. He had learning difficulties, and his behavior had drawn attention. After lengthy questioning, Buckland confessed to Dawn's murder, but not to Linda's. Though it gave the appearance of closure, something about his confession felt forced. There were gaps in his story. Investigators, uneasy with what they had, looked for a way to confirm or contradict his guilt. That's when they turned to a geneticist named Dr. Alec Jeffreys at the University of Leicester. Just 2 years earlier, Jeffreys had pioneered a new technique called DNA profiling. Until then, it had never been used in a criminal investigation. The police asked him to analyze biological evidence from both crime scenes. What Jeffreys discovered was nothing short of extraordinary. First, the DNA showed that both girls had been assaulted and killed by the same individual, confirming the cases were linked. But even more shocking, the DNA proved Richard Buckland was not the perpetrator. Though he had confessed under pressure, he had no connection to the crime scene evidence. It was a groundbreaking moment. The first time in history DNA was used to clear a suspect. The charges against Buckland were dropped, and the search for the real killer resumed. With this new technology in hand, law enforcement launched an unprecedented effort: a mass DNA screening. Around 5,000 men from the local area were asked to voluntarily provide saliva or blood samples. The idea was bold. Somewhere in that sea of samples, a match might be waiting. It was the first mass DNA screening of its kind, and it captured national attention. But months passed, and nothing matched. The case appeared to stall again, until a conversation in a pub cracked it wide open. Ian Kelly, a local man, was overheard bragging that he had taken the DNA test not for himself, but on behalf of someone else. Investigators quickly tracked him down, and he confessed. Kelly had posed as Colin Pitchfork, a local baker with a criminal past. Pitchfork had convinced Kelly to impersonate him and submit a sample using false identification. When confronted, Kelly admitted he had been manipulated and pressured. Police immediately arrested Colin Pitchfork. When a legitimate sample of his DNA was tested, the results were conclusive. It matched the evidence from both crime scenes. Pitchfork was the killer. In a formal interview, he eventually confessed to both murders and provided specific details only the perpetrator would know. He admitted to targeting Linda and Dawn, confirming the worst fears of investigators and the community. In January 1988, Colin Pitchfork was sentenced to life in prison for the two murders. His conviction marked a pivotal moment in criminal justice history. For the first time, DNA profiling had been used not just to identify a murderer, but also to protect an innocent person from wrongful conviction. It was a dual breakthrough that would forever redefine how the law sought truth. The ripple effects of the case were felt worldwide. Law enforcement agencies began establishing DNA databases, forensic labs shifted their priorities, and science became inseparable from modern policing. What was once seen as experimental science became a pillar of courtroom evidence. Legal systems had a new standard, one that could speak for those who no longer could. For the families of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, justice brought some sense of resolution, though the loss remained immeasurable. Their daughters' lives were stolen, but their cases sparked a revolution that would protect countless others. Today, the story of their murders is taught not just in criminology courses, but in history classes, forensic science programs, and legal ethics seminars around the world. And while 10-Pound Lane still winds quietly through the English countryside, it carries with it a legacy far greater than its name. It stands as a quiet reminder of what was lost, and what was gained through truth written in our DNA. Case 18. Operation Minstead, the Night Stalker, UK. For over 17 years, an unknown predator prowled the quiet neighborhoods of southeast London. His targets were not what most people expected. They weren't young women or high-risk individuals. They were the elderly, men and women in their 60s, 70s, even 90s. In their own homes, many asleep, some already frail from illness, they became victims of a man who operated in silence, struck without warning, and vanished without a trace. The police called him the Night Stalker. But to the people he attacked, he was something far more terrifying, the face of fear inside their sanctuary. Delroy Easton Grant appeared to be a caring father and devoted carer. He worked in the community, helping people who couldn't help themselves. But behind this mask was a man who had studied his victims, sometimes for days. He disabled their lights, removed light bulbs, cut telephone wires, and forced entry only when he was certain no one would stop him. What followed were hours of humiliation, fear, and, for many, irreversible trauma. More than 100 cases were eventually linked to the same DNA profile. The pattern was chilling, the details were consistent, and yet, for nearly 2 decades, he remained untouchable. Operation Minstead was launched in 1992, becoming one of the largest and longest-running investigations in the history of the Metropolitan Police. Over time, investigators realized they were dealing with a single offender, one who was meticulous, mobile, and knew how to avoid being caught. Despite deploying surveillance, creating a full behavioral profile, and collecting an enormous volume of forensic evidence, Grant stayed one step ahead. Officers even monitored graveyards and footpaths in hopes of catching him en route to an attack. But the Night Stalker was methodical, and the community was left with no name, no face, and no justice. Then, in 2009, everything changed. A new push within Operation Minstead led to renewed surveillance, and this time, they had a breakthrough. Detectives noticed a car that matched earlier descriptions and linked it to a man in his 50s, Delroy Grant. When they stopped him, they found tools, gloves, and maps in his vehicle. A DNA test soon confirmed what the evidence had been trying to say for years. Grant was the Night Stalker. He had been living in plain sight, even volunteering with local organizations and participating in school activities. His calm demeanor had concealed the damage he had caused. During the trial, the full scope of Grant's crimes came into focus. Victims testified in closed courtrooms, their voices trembling as they described being awoken in the dark by an intruder. Some had never told anyone until now. Their stories revealed the depth of his cruelty. He wasn't just entering homes. He was breaking spirits. In 2011, Delroy Grant was sentenced to 4 life terms, with a minimum of 27 years. For many survivors, it wasn't just the end of a case. It was the beginning of healing. The court's ruling finally acknowledged the pain that had been silenced for too long. But questions remained. How had he evaded capture for so long? Why did earlier investigations fail to connect the dots, even after multiple DNA samples and similar case patterns? Some pointed to systemic blind spots, delays in evidence processing, lack of communication between precincts, and a failure to prioritize elderly victims in crime investigations. Others called it a failure of imagination. No one had believed that someone could target seniors with such precision and cruelty. The case led to internal reviews and public scrutiny, pushing law enforcement to rethink how it investigates serial offenses against vulnerable populations. More than a decade later, the impact of Operation Minstead is still being felt. The case has become part of police training manuals and criminology studies. It sparked reforms in victim support services, especially for the elderly, and helped push for better forensic coordination. It also forced a conversation in Britain about how we value the lives and safety of our aging population. If the Night Stalker had targeted a different group, would justice have come sooner? This case is a reminder that monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they walk among us, dressed like caregivers, acting like friends. And it reminds us of the quiet strength of survivors, Those who endured, spoke up, and refused to be forgotten. In the end, their voices helped expose a predator and bring peace to a community haunted for too long. Grant's arrest did more than close a file. It restored the dignity of people who had lived in fear and proved that even the longest nightmares can end. Case 19. The Murder of Anna Jean Kane, 1988, Pennsylvania, USA. It was the morning of October 23, 1988, when a Pennsylvania Department of Transportation worker stumbled upon something unexpected along a stretch of road near Ontelaunee Trail in Perry Township. Lying in the brush was the body of a woman, later identified as 26-year-old Anna Jean Kane. She had suffered a fatal assault, her body showing evidence of multiple serious injuries. Investigators were called to the scene, where they recovered physical evidence, including a cigarette butt found nearby. Despite processing the crime scene carefully, the Berks County authorities were left with little to go on. Kane's lifestyle, which included sex work, led investigators to believe she may have been targeted due to vulnerability, but no strong leads emerged. The case quickly grew cold. In the decades that followed, the cigarette butt and other biological evidence were preserved. In 1998, the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, was launched, creating a national database to compare DNA profiles from crime scenes with those of known offenders. That same year, investigators entered DNA from Kane's case into the system. It didn't generate a match. For over 20 years, Kane's murder remained unresolved, a chilling mystery that haunted her family and the quiet community where her body was found. Everything changed in 2022. Advancements in forensic science, particularly in the field of investigative genetic genealogy, gave new life to the case. The Berks County District Attorney's Office partnered with Parabon Nanolabs and the FBI to analyze the DNA from the cigarette butt again. Using family tree building and DNA matches from public databases, investigators began piecing together a profile. Their search led them to Scott Grimm, a local man who had died in 2018 at the age of 58. Grimm had never been arrested for any major crime and thus had no DNA profile in CODIS. He had flown under the radar for decades. To confirm the connection, investigators obtained a sample from a 2002 harassment case in which Grimm had been accused of sending an anonymous threatening letter. That sample matched the cigarette DNA from the 1988 crime scene. The evidence was enough to identify him as the person who had been with Anna Jean Kane before her death. With the identity finally revealed, prosecutors made the announcement in February 2023. Though Grimm was deceased and could not be brought to trial, the long-standing mystery of Kane's death had finally found an answer. For Kane's family, the news brought a complicated mix of emotions. Her daughter, Tamika Reyes, told reporters that she was grateful to know who had taken her mother's life, but also saddened that the man would never face justice in court. "It's not the outcome we hoped for, but it brings us peace," she said. Kane was remembered as a vibrant and loving mother, someone whose life was cut short too soon. The case was one of the oldest in Pennsylvania to be solved using modern forensic genealogy techniques, setting a precedent for other investigations. Though questions remain, particularly about Grimm's motive, the resolution of the case underscores the power of science, patience, and determination. Anna Jean Kane's story reminds us that time may pass, but the pursuit of justice does not fade. With every new tool and breakthrough, another silent case gains a voice. For the Kane family, that voice finally said what they had waited 35 years to hear: "We know who did it." Case 20. The death of baby Teresa, 2009, Wisconsin, USA. In April 2009, the people of Dodge County, Wisconsin awoke to a chilling discovery. Tucked deep within a wooded area near the small village of Teresa, a man stumbled upon a garbage bag lying near the tree line. When he opened it, what he found left the entire state stunned: the body of a full-term newborn baby girl. She had no name, no blanket, no note, only silence. The community, shaken and grieving, named her Baby Teresa, after the town where her body was found. For over a decade, no one knew who she was, where she had come from, or what had happened during those final moments of her brief life. The medical examiner determined that the baby girl may have been stillborn or passed away shortly after birth. There were no visible signs of trauma. She had been placed in the bag and left out in the open, alone and exposed. Although no immediate criminal charges were filed at the time, investigators never gave up. The case haunted local detectives and led to a funeral funded by community donations. Baby Teresa was buried with flowers and prayers, despite having no known relatives present. The mystery surrounding her identity lingered like a shadow over the town. For years, the file remained open, cold but never forgotten. Evidence was preserved, including the infant's DNA. Still, no matches came. The wooded site where she was found remained undisturbed, and the community's questions remained unanswered. Why had no one come forward? Who was the mother? And what had led to such a tragic end? Then, in early 2022, forensic technology finally caught up with the case. Using advanced genealogy, the same technique that had helped solve high-profile cold cases nationwide, investigators submitted baby Teresa's preserved DNA to genealogical databases. Slowly, through distant matches and family tree reconstruction, they were able to trace the biological line back to one person, a Wisconsin woman named Karen Luttinen. Karen was identified as baby Teresa's biological mother. At the time of the baby's death in 2009, she had been in her early 20s. According to law enforcement and court records, Karen had concealed her pregnancy from nearly everyone around her, including her family. The pregnancy had not been medically documented, and she later told investigators that she had gone into labor alone, at home. Her statements revealed a deep state of emotional denial. She claimed to have panicked after giving birth and, overwhelmed and afraid, placed the baby's body in the woods. When finally confronted by investigators in 2022, Luttinen did not deny the facts. She admitted to giving birth in secret and leaving the newborn's body in the woods near Teresa. The prosecution did not pursue charges related to causing the baby's death. Instead, they charged her with concealing the death of a child, a felony under Wisconsin law. According to the medical examiner, there had been no evidence of trauma, and the baby's exact time and cause of death could not be confirmed due to decomposition. In court, Luttinen's defense painted a picture of a young woman in a mental health crisis, unprepared for motherhood and in complete denial about her condition. She had not received any prenatal care, and there was no indication she had told anyone she was pregnant. Luttinen expressed deep remorse and did not fight the charges. She ultimately pleaded guilty, and in a sentencing hearing filled with quiet tension, she was given 6 months in jail and probation. The sentence drew mixed reactions. Some members of the public felt it was too lenient, given the emotional weight of the case. Others saw it as a fair resolution for a woman who had not harmed her child in a traditional sense, but had clearly failed to seek help or make a safe plan. The court acknowledged the complexity, noting that Luttinen had lived for 13 years with the weight of what she had done. There had been no further criminal activity, and she had led an otherwise quiet life. Still, the act of discarding a newborn's body was one the justice system could not ignore. Baby Teresa's case is just one of many in the U.S. where women have concealed pregnancies and abandoned newborns. These cases often stem from fear, mental health issues, or a complete breakdown of social support. In response to such tragedies, safe haven laws exist in all 50 states, allowing parents to safely and anonymously surrender a newborn at designated locations, like hospitals or fire stations, without fear of prosecution. Wisconsin had such a law in place in 2009, but in baby Teresa's case, it was never used. What stands out about this case is how science, patience, and persistence finally delivered a resolution. The use of DNA and genetic genealogy didn't just solve a mystery, it gave a name, a face, and a mother to a child who had once been completely unknown. It also raised questions about how many more cases like this may exist. Infants left behind, unidentified, their stories buried in silence. There's another baby Teresa whose story, while entirely unrelated, adds weight to this name. In 1992, Teresa Ann Campo Pearson was born in Florida with a fatal condition called anencephaly, a rare and severe birth defect where major portions of the brain and skull are missing. She had a brain stem, which allowed for basic survival functions like heartbeat and breathing, but no chance at consciousness or long-term life. Doctors told her parents she would pass away within days. Knowing there was no hope for their daughter's survival, Teresa's parents requested her organs be donated to other infants in need. They hoped their baby's brief life could give another child a chance. But Florida law, like the law in every U.S. state, required organ donors to be declared dead before donation. Because baby Teresa's heart was still beating and she was breathing, she was considered legally alive. The parents' request was denied. 9 days later, baby Teresa passed away naturally, but by then her organs could no longer be used. The Florida case ignited a national conversation about the ethics of organ donation and the definition of death. Should the law allow parents to donate organs from infants who are medically beyond saving but legally still alive? Was the dead donor rule a long-standing principle meant to protect the sanctity of life, preventing life-saving interventions for others? In hospitals, courtrooms, and classrooms, baby Teresa's story became a focal point for one of the most painful and complex questions in medical ethics. Together, these two cases, separated by 17 years and 1,500 miles, both carry the same name. But more than that, they carry echoes of society's deepest questions about life, death, responsibility, and mercy. One child was abandoned in a forest, lost in silence for over a decade. Another was surrounded by love but still left powerless by the system. Both left behind more questions than answers. These stories remind us that behind every baby found headline is a tangle of fear, failure, ethics, and law, and often a chance for change. Their names, though brief in the public eye, deserve to be remembered. Case 21, the Somerton Man Mystery. Carl Charles Webb, 1948, Adelaide, Australia. It began with a man lying on Somerton Beach, dressed in a suit and slumped against a sea wall as if resting. But he wasn't. When police arrived on December 1, 1948, it was clear this was no accident. The man had no wallet, no ID, and no clear cause of death. Even, the labels in his clothes had been meticulously removed. Over time, he became known simply as the Somerton Man. For decades, Australia's most baffling cold case revolved around one question: who was he? The mystery gained national and international attention not only because of its strange details, but because no one could trace the man's origin. Investigators later discovered a suitcase linked to him at Adelaide railway station. Inside were basic items, all unmarked, except for a few with the name T. Keane. That clue went nowhere. A page torn from a rare edition of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam was later found in a hidden pocket of his trousers, bearing the cryptic Persian phrase, "Tamam shud," meaning, "it is finished." For years, theories abounded. Was he a spy? A lover spurned? A victim of a secret poison? Answers were elusive until July 2022. After more than 70 years, forensic experts led by Professor Derek Abbott and genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick made a breakthrough. By extracting DNA from a single hair trapped in the Somerton Man's plaster death mask, the team constructed an autosomal SNP profile. Using modern forensic genetic genealogy, they matched this DNA to distant relatives in public databases. After extensive family tree mapping, they identified the man as Carl Charles Webb, a 43-year-old electrical engineer and instrument maker from Melbourne. Webb was born in 1905. He had a sparse public record but was known to have worked with precision instruments. His marriage ended in separation shortly before his disappearance, with divorce proceedings initiated by his wife in 1951 on the grounds of desertion. Notably, Webb's sister had married a man named Thomas Keane, a compelling detail, given that the name T. Keane appeared on several items found in the railway suitcase. Though this may have seemed insignificant decades ago, it now served as a key corroborating link in the identification. The significance of this finding cannot be overstated. It marked one of the first times forensic genealogy had solved such a high-profile mystery in Australia. Professor Abbott stated, "We were able to build an extended family tree stretching back several generations. Through that, we connected the DNA sample directly to Carl Webb. While the identification has been widely accepted by experts in the genealogy field, it has not yet been formally confirmed by South Australia Police or the state coroner, who are conducting their own DNA analysis from Webb's exhumed remains. What remains puzzling is not the man's name, but his story. Why did Carl Webb leave Melbourne? What brought him to Adelaide? And why did he die under such mysterious circumstances on a beach, with no signs of violence or trauma? The toxicology tests from 1948 were limited by the technology of the time, and many experts have speculated about poisoning, undetectable substances, or underlying health conditions. Yet no conclusive cause of death has ever been confirmed. Adding another layer of intrigue is Webb's connection, or potential connection, to cryptic writings. That copy of the Rubaiyat was discovered months later in a car near the beach. It contained a handwritten code that to this day has not been cracked. Some theorists suggest the code could relate to betting or horse racing systems, while others believe it was personal or emotional. Nothing definitively ties the writing to espionage, but the context of the Cold War era continues to feed speculation. Carl Webb himself appears to have been a man gradually slipping through the cracks. His work life was unstable and his marriage had collapsed. No missing persons report had ever been filed in his name, which may explain why his body remained unidentified for so long. Records show that he had a keen interest in literature and electronics, but little else is known about his emotional or mental state in the months leading up to his disappearance. One of the key goals of Professor Abbott's ongoing research is to find a verified photograph of Carl Webb. Despite locating birth records and marriage documents, no confirmed image of him has surfaced. This absence is striking. It means that while the Somerton man now has a name, we still don't know his face. For a case so obsessed with identity, this unresolved detail adds a poignant twist: recognition without visual confirmation. The cultural fascination with the Somerton man has only grown over the years. Books, documentaries, and even fictional accounts have drawn on the enigma. To many Australians, this case became symbolic of the unknown lives that sometimes slip between society's fingers. The fact that a man could vanish, die in public, and remain anonymous for decades felt both unsettling and tragic. Now, that weight has partially lifted, but the emotional and investigative work continues. While the public may never learn exactly how Carl Webb died or why he came to Adelaide, the power of forensic science has at least restored part of his identity. As Professor Abbott noted in a press interview, we may never know what happened in his final hours, but we can say one thing for certain: he is no longer the man without a name. Case 22. The murder of Tanya Lee Glover, 2022, Australia. Tanya Lee Glover's disappearance didn't spark a search. There were no missing person posters, no late-night news bulletins, no police briefings pleading for public tips. When she vanished in 2010, her absence was mistaken for distance. Her family thought she had simply moved away, possibly to another part of the country. With no official report filed and no one raising concern, Tanya was quietly erased from the visible world. It wasn't until December 7, 2022, over a decade later, that her story resurfaced in the most unsettling way. Cleaners at an apartment complex in Alderley, a suburb of Brisbane, made a discovery that stunned authorities. While clearing out a storage space in the basement of the building, they noticed a section of a concrete block wall that looked recently altered. Behind it, wrapped tightly in layers of bedding and clothing, were the skeletal remains of a woman. There were no immediate clues to who she was or how long she had been there. Forensic teams spent months working to identify the body. Due to the level of decomposition, traditional methods offered little progress. But in August 2023, through familial DNA testing, scientists confirmed the remains were those of Tanya Lee Glover. She had been 38 years old at the time of her death. Tanya was both hearing and visually impaired, and had lived a quiet, structured life in supported housing in Fortitude Valley, just 5 kilometers from where she was eventually found. Authorities believe she was killed shortly after her disappearance in 2010, and her body concealed in the basement shortly thereafter. What makes the case particularly tragic is how easily Tanya's death could have gone unnoticed forever. Because she lived in government-supported accommodation, her rent continued to be paid automatically for some time after her passing, a detail that would later become central to the investigation. Her case highlights the severe risk faced by isolated individuals in public housing systems, especially those with disabilities or few close connections. In March 2025, a significant development broke the silence that had surrounded the case for so long. A 61-year-old woman, who had been known to Glover at the time of her disappearance and lived at the Alderley complex, was arrested in Townsville. She was charged with 1 count of murder, 1 count of misconduct with a human body, and 1 count of fraud. Authorities allege that she not only played a role in concealing Tanya's remains, but also continued to collect benefits tied to her identity. The fraudulent use of rent payments over several months suggested a deliberate cover-up rather than a moment of panic. Due to the condition of the remains, investigators could not definitively determine Tanya's cause of death. However, they noted signs of trauma and concluded that the circumstances surrounding her disappearance and concealment warranted treatment as a homicide. The exact motive remains unclear. The accused has not entered a plea and the case is ongoing. Authorities have transferred it to the Brisbane Magistrates Court, where legal proceedings continue. In an effort to encourage further leads, the Queensland government has offered a $500,000 AUD reward for information that results in a conviction. The case has since raised serious questions about oversight in housing facilities and how vulnerable individuals can vanish unnoticed. There were no red flags on official records, no missed welfare checks, no complaints filed by neighbors. In the eyes of the system, Tanya was simply gone, and no one asked where or why. Friends and former acquaintances who have since come forward described her as reserved but polite. She had routines, rarely engaged in conflicts, and often kept to herself. She relied heavily on the stability that her supported housing arrangement provided. For those who now look back, it's the silence surrounding her absence that continues to haunt. How could a person live and die in the same housing network without anyone noticing? How many others, like Tanya, could vanish in bureaucratic blind spots? As the investigation proceeds, it's not just about securing a conviction. It's about correcting a failure, one that allowed a woman to be hidden in plain sight for 13 years. A failure that speaks volumes about how institutions treat the unseen, the unheard, and the uncounted. Tanya Lee Glover was not a transient. She was a person with a name, a story, and a right to be safe. Her death, and the years she spent behind a wall, now demand answers. Case 23. The disappearance of William Tyrrell. William Tyrrell was only 3 years old when he vanished without a trace from the quiet town of Kendal, New South Wales. It was September 12, 2014, a spring morning that began like any other. William, dressed in a Spider-Man suit, had been playing on the lawn of his foster grandmother's home. His foster mother had stepped inside to make a cup of tea. By the time she returned, mere minutes later, William was gone. No scream, no struggle, no evidence of his direction, just silence. The boy who loved superheroes became the face of a real-life mystery that would haunt Australia for years. The search that followed was one of the largest in the country's history. Police, volunteers, helicopters, and dogs combed the surrounding bushland for days, but no trace was found. For a time, hope lingered. Maybe William had wandered off. Maybe he'd be found curled up somewhere. But the days turned into weeks, and as the search expanded, so did the questions. Who could have taken him from such a rural, remote location? And more importantly, why? For years, the public believed William was with his biological parents on the day he vanished. It wasn't until much later that it was revealed he was in foster care. This detail, kept quiet to protect his identity, sparked a wave of media attention and public debate once disclosed. The revelation forced investigators and journalists alike to reassess timelines, interviews, and possibilities. Strikeforce Roseanne, the unit assigned to William's case, pursued hundreds of leads, interviewed scores of people, and examined several persons of interest. But no charges were filed, and no one was ever arrested. In 2019, a public inquest was launched to re-examine every step taken in the investigation. The inquest revealed gaps in the early response. raising concerns about overlooked witnesses and missed opportunities. Still, it uncovered no definitive answers. In 2021, New South Wales police returned to Kendall for an intensive new search of the surrounding bushland based on new evidence. Officers believed William's remains may have been buried nearby. Excavations were carried out. Soil was analyzed. Items of interest were collected and tested. But again, the case remained unresolved. Investigators have said they believe William is deceased, but without a body, without a witness, and without a confession, that remains a theory, no matter how likely. The mystery of what happened to William Tyrrell endures not only because of the silence around his disappearance, but because of the image that won't leave the minds of millions. A wide-eyed little boy, dressed in red and blue, pretending to be a superhero, one moment laughing on the grass, the next, gone. His photo remains on flyers, search websites, and anniversary memorials. His family, both foster and biological, continue to ask for answers. Authorities still urge anyone with information to come forward, emphasizing that even the smallest detail could finally bring closure to a case that has become one of Australia's most heartbreaking cold cases. Until that day comes, William remains the missing boy who vanished without a sound in a place that was supposed to be safe. Case 24, the case of the Ragged Man, Stefan Kisko. For 16 years, Stefan Kisko sat behind bars for a crime he did not commit. A crime so horrific that the community demanded swift justice. But what unfolded in the years that followed revealed one of the most devastating miscarriages of justice in British legal history. The case of Stefan Kisko, often referred to as the Ragged Man case, is a cautionary tale of flawed investigations, suppressed evidence, and the irreparable cost of rushing to judgment. It began on October 5, 1975, in Rochdale, Greater Manchester. 11-year-old Leslie Molseed left home to run a simple errand and never returned. 3 days later, her body was found on Rishworth Moor in neighboring West Yorkshire. The crime scene stunned investigators. Leslie had suffered multiple injuries, and the nature of the attack pointed to a disturbing level of premeditation. With no witnesses and rising public pressure, authorities cast a wide net, and soon zeroed in on a man who, by all accounts, seemed ill-equipped to defend himself. Stefan Kisko, a 23-year-old tax clerk, lived a quiet life with his mother, Charlotte. He had been diagnosed with hypogonadism, a medical condition that affected his hormonal development, leaving him with a childlike demeanor and limited social skills. Described by neighbors as harmless and withdrawn, Kisko became an unlikely suspect when local teenagers falsely claimed he had exposed himself in public. Those accusations, later retracted, became the spark that lit the fire of suspicion. Once in custody, Kisko was interrogated for days without legal representation. His repeated requests to have his mother present were denied. He was subjected to long hours of questioning, and when fatigue set in, officers wrote a confession on his behalf. Believing he would be allowed to go home if he signed the paper, he did. That coerced confession became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. No physical evidence tied him to the crime, except for one deeply flawed piece of forensic testimony. At trial, the prosecution withheld critical scientific evidence. Forensic testing on the victim's clothing revealed the presence of sperm cells. But Stefan Kisko, due to his medical condition, was incapable of producing sperm. That detail alone should have ruled him out as a suspect. Instead, the jury convicted him in 1976, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Kisko's time behind bars was marked by fear, isolation, and abuse. As someone convicted of a child-related offense, he became a target for other inmates and was assaulted multiple times. For his safety, he was eventually placed in near-total solitary confinement. His mental health, already fragile, deteriorated rapidly. One psychiatrist even claimed he suffered from delusions of innocence because he consistently maintained that he had not committed the crime. In truth, Stefan was telling the only truth he had ever known. He didn't do it. Outside prison walls, his mother Charlotte never gave up. Year after year, she fought to prove her son's innocence, writing to anyone who would listen. Eventually, she found allies in solicitor Campbell Malone and forensic experts who agreed to re-examine the case. The turning point came in 1991, when advances in DNA profiling allowed scientists to conclusively determine that the sperm found on Leslie Molseed's clothing could not have come from Kisco. This critical evidence had been known but ignored, or worse, deliberately suppressed by the original investigators. In February 1992, the Court of Appeal quashed Stefan Kisco's conviction. The judges acknowledged that a grave injustice had occurred. He was released after 5,175 days in prison, but his freedom came at a devastating cost. His health was broken, his spirit dimmed. He had entered prison a young man and returned a shell of who he once was. Less than 2 years later, Stefan Kisco died of a heart attack at age 41. His mother, who had lived long enough to see him freed, passed away shortly afterward. Justice, however, was not yet complete. For decades, the true killer remained unidentified. In 2007, 32 years after Leslie's death and 15 years after Stefan's exoneration, DNA evidence finally led investigators to Ronald Castry, a taxi driver with a violent history. His DNA was a direct match to the evidence from the original crime scene. Castry was arrested, tried, and convicted of Leslie Molseed's murder. He received a life sentence, bringing long overdue accountability to a case that had already caused immeasurable damage. The tragedy of Stefan Kisco's story exposed deep cracks in the criminal justice system: flawed interrogation practices, confirmation bias, the suppression of exculpatory evidence, and the vulnerability of defendants with learning difficulties. It also highlighted how forensic advancements, when properly used, can right terrible wrongs. But for Stefan, the apology came too late. No compensation, no conviction of the true perpetrator, and no official inquiry could restore the years stolen from him. His case remains one of the United Kingdom's most painful reminders that justice delayed is justice denied. Today, legal scholars still study Kisco's story as a blueprint for what not to do in criminal investigations. It also stands as a tribute to a mother's unbreakable love and the quiet endurance of a man who never stopped telling the truth. Case 25. The Death of Azaria Chamberlain. It was the winter of 1980 in Australia, and the Chamberlain family had set out on what was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip at Uluru, then known as Ayers Rock. Lindy and Michael Chamberlain, along with their sons Aidan and Reagan, were joined by their 9-week-old daughter, Azaria. They pitched their tent like many other tourists, unaware that this remote site would soon become the center of a case that would divide a nation. On the night of August 17th, Lindy put Azaria to sleep in the tent's bassinet. Not long after, she noticed a movement and cried out in panic, words that would echo for decades. "A dingo's got my baby." What followed was a frantic search through the scrubland and red sands. Despite the community and authorities responding quickly, Azaria was gone. Her torn jumpsuit was discovered later near a rock formation, but no body was found. From the very beginning, Lindy's account, that a wild dingo had taken her child, was met with skepticism by both the public and investigators. Dingoes were not yet widely acknowledged as a real threat to human life, especially infants, and the idea seemed too implausible for many to accept. The first coronial inquest in 1981 actually supported Lindy's account. The coroner concluded that a dingo attack was the most likely cause of Azaria's disappearance. However, he also noted the possibility of human intervention after the attack, which opened the door for further scrutiny. Instead of bringing closure, the findings triggered more suspicion. Fueled by media sensationalism and persistent rumors, a second inquest was convened. This time, the tone shifted. Prosecutors questioned Lindy's demeanor, her faith, and even Azaria's name, suggesting without evidence that it had dark or symbolic meaning. The focus turned away from facts and toward framing. In 1982, Lindy Chamberlain was formally charged with murder. The prosecution argued that she had taken Azaria to the front seat of their car and ended her life, later staging the dingo story as a cover-up. Michael Chamberlain was charged as an accessory. Central to the case was forensic evidence claiming the presence of fetal blood in the family's vehicle, a finding that was later proven entirely incorrect. But at the time, the court accepted it as reliable. Lindy was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Michael received a suspended sentence. The verdict shocked the public, but many still believed the justice system had acted correctly. While Lindy was in prison, she gave birth to her fourth child, Kalia. She raised her for a short time behind bars, while continuing to maintain her innocence. Then, in 1986, a British tourist named David Brett fell to his death while hiking near Uluru. During the recovery effort, searchers discovered a small white matinee jacket, partially buried near a known dingo den. It was the very jacket Lindy had long claimed Azaria had been wearing the night she vanished, an item the prosecution insisted had never existed. The discovery instantly changed the tone of the case. Within days, Lindy Chamberlain was released from prison. The discovery of the jacket validated her account in the most tragic and undeniable way. A royal commission was swiftly ordered to re-examine the entire case. In 1988, the Northern Territory Supreme Court unanimously overturned both convictions. The Chamberlains were exonerated. Investigators conceded that the original forensic analysis was flawed and that circumstantial evidence had wrongly been given the weight of hard proof. Years later, one of the forensic scientists who testified against them would express regret over the role that evidence played in the miscarriage of justice. The fallout extended beyond the courtroom. Lindy and Michael's marriage, long strained under the weight of public scrutiny and grief, eventually ended in divorce. While Lindy was no longer behind bars, the stigma lingered. Tabloid media and televised interviews often painted her as cold, even suspicious, focusing on her tone rather than her trauma. Public opinion was slow to shift, and the family had to fight to restore their reputation in a world that had already made up its mind. A third coronial inquest in 1995 offered little resolution. It returned an open finding, unable to determine the precise cause of Azaria's death. But Lindy never gave up. She continued to push for legal acknowledgement of the truth. Finally, in 2012, over 3 decades after Azaria's disappearance, a fourth and final inquest brought closure. Coroner Elizabeth Morris ruled unequivocally that Azaria had died as the result of being attacked and taken by a dingo. An amended death certificate was issued. The Chamberlain family stood before cameras once again, this time with a measure of relief and vindication. In her statement outside the courtroom, Lindy said, "We're relieved and delighted to come to the end of this saga. No longer will Australia be able to say that dingoes are not dangerous." Her words weren't just about her daughter, they were about every future case where assumptions might override evidence. The ruling forced both the legal system and the media to reckon with the consequences of bias, public pressure, and institutional failure. The Chamberlain case changed how Australia viewed forensic science, trial by media, and the power of public opinion. It became a global case study on wrongful conviction and the human cost of flawed investigations. The phrase, "a dingo's got my baby," had once been mocked in pop culture. But over time, people came to understand the real pain behind those words. Lindy had become a symbol, not of tragedy alone, but of resilience in the face of public shaming and injustice. The loss of Azaria was unbearable, but her story sparked legal reforms and greater awareness about the danger of groupthink in high-profile cases. In the years since the final ruling, both Lindy and Michael have worked to educate others about the importance of listening to facts, not just headlines. Their family's journey was filled with heartbreak, but it stood as a testament to the power of persistence and truth. Azaria Chamberlain's name remains etched in Australia's legal history, not only as a victim, but as the reason for long overdue change. Thank you for your incredible support. This channel thrives because of viewers like you. Join our YouTube membership today to unlock exclusive perks, enjoy premium content, and help us keep creating the stories you love. Which story do you want to be covered?